There is a sound the world has forgotten. The absolute silence of distance. Not the silence we know now, interrupted by notifications and ringtones, but true silence, the kind that inhabited the space between bodies separated by oceans, mountains, storms. It was a silence that killed. A sailor on the high seas could not scream loud enough for his voice to reach the shore. A mother in Boston could not whisper in her son's ear in California. Lovers separated by war wrote letters that arrived months later, when the heart that wrote them no longer beat. The world was vast and the human voice minuscule, fragile, mortal. Imagine the 19th century as an iron giant with plugged ears. Locomotives roared across continents, spewing black smoke like industrial dragons. Factories multiplied objects, fortunes, entire cities sprouting from the ground like mushrooms after rain. But words, those invisible constructions that sustained love, hope, fear, could not travel faster than a horse. Humanity had conquered physical space but remained prisoner of time. A message from London to New York took weeks to cross the Atlantic, swaying in the belly of a steamship, written on paper that wrinkled with salty humidity, words that aged before reaching their destination. And in those weeks, everything could change. People died. Wars ended. Businesses collapsed. Love grew cold. The telegraph had arrived like a lightning bolt of hope. Samuel Morse had demonstrated that electricity could carry messages at the speed of light, transforming the alphabet into pulses, dots and dashes that danced through copper wires like frantic ants. It was a miracle without doubt. Merchants celebrated. Military men rubbed their hands together. Empires expanded with the confidence of those who could coordinate armies from a distance. But the telegraph was deaf and mute. It could not transmit a sigh, a tremor in the voice, that pause full of meaning that occurs when someone is about to confess a secret. It could not cry, could not laugh. It was efficient, yes, but it lacked soul. Mothers who received telegrams about the death of their sons in the Civil War read words like wounded stop, deceased stop, returning by train stop. And those words were cold daggers, devoid of the hand that should hold them, of the voice that should break them with weeping. Humanity had learned to move information but not presence. And so, in the mid-19th century, the world pulsed with a new urgency. It was not just the desire to know what was happening on the other side of the world, but to feel it. To hear the breathing of a loved one. To confirm, through the timbre of a voice, that the person who wrote those letters still existed, was still the same. The Industrial Revolution had separated families like never before. Men emigrated to America in search of gold, work, land. They left behind entire villages in Ireland, Italy, Poland, Germany. Women stayed behind waiting, counting the days, reading letters that arrived months late if they arrived at all. Children grew up without knowing their fathers' voices. Fathers died without having embraced their children again. Economic progress had torn the human fabric, and now that fabric bled silence. But somewhere in that vast continent of need, a seed was germinating. It was not just a technical idea, not simply the whim of a brilliant inventor. It was something deeper, more visceral. It was the echo of a personal tragedy that would become collective hope. It was the story of a boy who grew up trapped between sound and silence, and who would dedicate his life to building a bridge between both worlds. Scotland, 1847. The air smells of perpetual rain, of peat burning in stone fireplaces, of wet wool. In Edinburgh, a city of steep streets and grey skies, Alexander Graham Bell is born. His first cry is heard incompletely. His mother, Eliza, leans over the cradle but does not hear the full scream. She lives in a muffled world, where sounds arrive like distant whispers, as if the entire universe were wrapped in cotton. Eliza Grace Simons Bell is almost deaf, a condition that has accompanied her since youth, gradually stealing from her symphonies, conversations, the singing of birds. But she has learned to compensate. She reads lips with an almost supernatural skill. She feels the vibrations of music through the floor. When her son cries, she places her hand on his chest and feels the tremor of his lungs, the frequency of his anguish. Alexander Melville Bell, the father, is the opposite. He is a man of words, an artist of elocution, a scientist of human language. Obsessed with phonetics, he dedicates his life to teaching correct speech, to polishing accents, to turning speech into something visible, measurable, perfectible. In his study hang diagrams of the human mouth, tongues drawn in impossible positions, throats dissected with anatomical precision. Alexander Sr. believes that sound is not a mystery but a mechanism. That each vowel, each consonant, can be broken down into muscular movements, air flows, calculated vibrations. His obsession leads him to invent something extraordinary: visible speech, a system of symbols that graphically represents how each sound of human language is produced. It is not an alphabet, it is a map of speech. With it, the deaf can learn to speak without ever having heard a word. And in the middle of these two worlds, that of silence and that of the perfect word, grows little Alec, as they call him at home. He is a curious child, with clear eyes and an intense gaze, who learns from very early on that communication is an act of will, not of chance. His mother cannot hear him if he simply speaks. He has to be in front of her, articulate clearly, use his hands. Alec discovers that when he sits at the piano and plays a note, his mother can feel the vibration if she rests her head against the wood. Thus, the boy and the woman develop a secret language. He plays melodies, she feels them. She does not hear them, she lives them through her skeleton. This childhood between vibrations and symbols, between sound that is seen and silence that is felt, marks Alexander Graham Bell forever. While other children play with tin soldiers and marbles, he chases echoes. He sits on the staircase of his house and listens to the resonance of his own voice bouncing off the walls, experimenting with how sound travels, how it transforms, how it dies. His father's work becomes his playground. The diagrams of visible speech are not just academic curiosities to young Alec, they are portals into understanding. He watches his father teach deaf students to pronounce words they have never heard, guiding their tongues and lips into positions that create sounds. It is like watching a sculptor work with flesh instead of marble. The father teaches that the letter P requires pressing the lips together and then releasing them with a small explosion of air. That the sound of A requires opening the mouth wide and letting the voice vibrate in the throat. That language is not magic but physics. And the boy absorbs this knowledge like a sponge, understanding that sound is both mystery and science, both art and engineering. But the Bell household is not just a laboratory of phonetics. It is also a place haunted by fear. Tuberculosis stalks the family like a patient wolf. In the damp Scottish climate, the disease thrives, moving from lung to lung, from brother to brother. Alec has two brothers, Melville James and Edward Charles. They are bright boys, full of promise, but their lungs are betraying them. The cough that starts as a minor annoyance becomes a constant companion. Blood appears on handkerchiefs. The family doctor speaks in hushed tones. There is no cure for consumption, only hope and better air. The boys grow thin, their eyes too large in their narrowing faces. They spend days in bed while Alec plays alone, increasingly alone. Death arrives first for Edward, the youngest. He is 19 years old, just beginning to understand the world, when the disease consumes him completely. The house fills with that particular silence that follows loss. Eliza cannot hear the absence, but she feels it in every room. The father buries himself in his work, teaching and writing as if words could build a wall against grief. And Alec, now a teenager, watches his surviving brother Melville begin the same descent, the same cough, the same bloody handkerchiefs. There is a cruelty in watching death approach slowly, in knowing the end before it arrives. Melville fights longer, but tuberculosis is patient. By 1867 he too is gone. Two brothers, two graves in Scottish soil. A family halved. The air of Edinburgh becomes unbearable, not just physically but psychologically. Every breath seems contaminated with memory. The doctors are clear. If the remaining Bells want to survive, they must leave. Scotland, with its perpetual dampness, its grey skies, its coal smoke mixing with fog, is killing them as surely as the disease killed the brothers. And so, in 1870, the family makes the wrenching decision to emigrate. Not just to move cities but to cross an ocean, to abandon their homeland entirely. They choose Canada, the vast emptiness of North America, where the air is said to be clean and the skies wide enough to contain grief. The journey across the Atlantic is a passage between worlds. Alexander Graham Bell, now 23 years old, stands on the deck of the ship and watches Scotland disappear into the mist. He is leaving behind everything familiar: the streets of Edinburgh, the university where he studied, the graves of his brothers, the accent of his childhood. He is sailing toward an unknown continent, carrying with him only his father's knowledge, his mother's resilience, and a grief so heavy it feels like iron in his chest. The ship rocks on the waves, and Bell thinks about distance, about separation, about all the voices that cannot cross water. He thinks about his dead brothers and wonders if they had been able to speak to each other across the void between life and death, what they would say. Canada receives them with wilderness. They settle in Brantford, Ontario, a small town where the air is indeed cleaner, colder, sharp in the lungs. The Bell family purchases a farm, and for a time they attempt to become something they are not: settlers, farmers, people of the land. But Bell's mind is not made for tilling soil. He is restless, haunted by loss, driven by a need to create something that matters. His father continues to teach visible speech, traveling to schools for the deaf, demonstrating his system. And Bell watches, learns, begins to teach as well. He discovers that he has a gift for reaching the unreachable, for finding ways to communicate with those whom society has given up on. His mother's deafness has trained him for this work. He knows intimately the frustration of trying to reach someone across a barrier of silence. In 1871, Bell moves to Boston. The city is a cauldron of innovation, a place where inventors and entrepreneurs gather like moths to flame. The newly founded Boston School for the Deaf needs teachers, and Bell's expertise in visible speech makes him invaluable. He begins teaching, and his methods are revolutionary. He does not just teach deaf students to mimic sounds. He teaches them to understand the mechanics of speech, to feel the vibrations, to see the shapes. His students include children who have never heard a single word, yet under his guidance they learn to speak with remarkable clarity. One of them years later will become the most famous deaf person in history, Helen Keller. But in 1871, Bell is just a young teacher, poor, idealistic, obsessed with bridging the gap between silence and sound. His days are long. He teaches during the day, working with students whose progress is measured in millimeters, in the slight improvement of a vowel sound, in the first time a child pronounces their own name. At night, he retreats to his boarding house and experiments. His room becomes a workshop of wire, wood, and strange contraptions. He is not alone in this obsession. The 19th century is an age of electrical experimentation, and every inventor with access to copper wire and a battery dreams of harnessing the mysterious power of electricity. The telegraph has proven that electrical current can carry information. But the telegraph requires trained operators, uses a code, cannot convey the human voice. Bell begins to wonder, why not? What if the vibrations of speech could be converted into electrical impulses? What if those impulses could travel through a wire and be converted back into sound at the other end? The idea seems absurd. Sound is air vibrating. Electricity is invisible force moving through metal. They are different domains of physics entirely. But Bell cannot let go of the thought. He dreams of speaking to his mother and having his voice reach her not through air she cannot hear, but through some other medium, some technological miracle that bypasses her deafness entirely. He dreams of connecting separated families, of letting voices cross oceans instantaneously. But obsession requires money, and Bell has almost none. Teaching pays barely enough for rent and food. His equipment is scavenged, borrowed, improvised. He builds resonators from tuning forks and cigar boxes. He wraps wire around magnets salvaged from old telegraph machines. His landlady complains about the noise, the strange humming sounds that emanate from his room at odd hours. His colleagues at the school think he is wasting his time. After all, dozens of inventors are chasing the same dream, men with far more resources, better connections, proper laboratories. Western Union, the telegraph monopoly, has teams of engineers working on the problem. Elisha Gray, a formidable inventor with multiple patents, is hot on the trail. And lurking in the background, almost forgotten by history, is Antonio Musi, an Italian immigrant who has already built a crude speaking device in his New York workshop but lacks the money to patent it properly. The race is crowded and Bell is running on empty. Yet Bell possesses something his competitors lack. It is not genius, though he has that in abundance. It is not training, though his father's work has given him unique insights. What Bell has is an abnormal sensitivity to sound itself, a relationship with vibration that borders on the mystical. From childhood, he has not just heard sounds but felt them, visualized them, understood them as patterns and frequencies. When he teaches a deaf child to produce the sound of the letter S, he can detect minute variations in the airflow, can hear the difference between a proper S and one that is slightly off. He can identify musical notes with perfect pitch, can tell the difference between instruments playing the same melody based on their harmonic overtones. This is not merely good hearing. This is something deeper, a kind of internal resonance, as if his nervous system itself is tuned to the physics of sound waves. He begins to spend hours experimenting with tuning forks. These simple metal instruments fascinate him because they prove that sound is a physical vibration that can be sustained, measured, predicted. When he strikes a tuning fork, it vibrates at a specific frequency. 440 Hz for the note A, for example. And if he brings another tuning fork tuned to the same frequency near the first, it begins to vibrate sympathetically, singing without being struck. This phenomenon, sympathetic resonance, becomes an obsession. Bell realizes that this is how the human ear works. Sound waves in the air cause the eardrum to vibrate, and those vibrations are transmitted through tiny bones to the cochlea, where they are translated into nerve impulses. The ear is a receiver tuned to the frequencies of human speech. What if he could build an artificial ear? What if he could create a membrane that vibrates in response to sound, and connect that membrane to an electrical circuit, so that the vibrations become electrical impulses, and then reverse the process at the other end? The idea is elegant in theory but nightmarishly complex in practice. Bell fills notebooks with diagrams, calculations, failed designs. He sketches membranes made of parchment, of metal, of stretched animal skin. He experiments with electromagnets of different sizes, with coils of wire wrapped in different configurations. Nothing works. The electrical impulses are too weak, too distorted. When he speaks into his experimental devices, the sound that emerges at the other end, if any sound emerges at all, is a garbled mess, more like static than speech. His frustration grows. He tears apart his machines and rebuilds them. He stays up until dawn, his eyes red with exhaustion, his fingers stained with acid and ink. During these dark months of failure, Bell discovers something unexpected about himself. He is not a systematic experimenter. He does not follow the careful, methodical approach that other inventors use, testing one variable at a time, keeping meticulous records. Instead, he works intuitively, following hunches, making leaps of logic that seem to come from nowhere. He will be struggling with a problem, unable to find a solution, and then something will trigger an insight. A student will mispronounce a word in a particular way, and suddenly Bell will understand something about vowel formation that helps him design a better diaphragm. He will be walking through Boston Common and hear a church bell ringing, and the overtones will suggest a new way to arrange his electromagnets. His mind makes connections that others do not see, drawing on his deep understanding of acoustics, his knowledge of human anatomy, his childhood experiments with his mother's piano. This intuitive approach makes his progress erratic. He will spend weeks going nowhere and then suddenly leap forward. His students become his anchor to sanity. Every morning he arrives at the Boston School for the Deaf and enters a world where his obsession with sound has immediate, visible purpose. The children he teaches come from all levels of society. Some are from wealthy families who can afford private tutors. Others are charity cases, children from poor neighborhoods who would otherwise spend their lives in institutions or isolated at home, unable to communicate. Bell treats them all the same. He is patient, encouraging, endlessly inventive in his teaching methods. When a child struggles to produce a particular sound, he will get down on his knees and place the child's hand on his throat so they can feel the vibration. He will use mirrors so they can watch the shape of his mouth. He will draw diagrams from his father's visible speech system, showing exactly how to position the tongue and lips. One of his students is a girl named Mabel Hubbard. She is 15 years old when she first enters his classroom, the daughter of Gardiner Green Hubbard, a wealthy Boston lawyer and businessman. Mabel lost her hearing at age 5 due to scarlet fever. Unlike Bell's mother, who was born with impaired hearing, Mabel once heard the world fully and then lost it. She remembers music, remembers her mother's voice, remembers the sound of rain. This makes her deafness both easier and harder. Easier because she has a mental library of sounds to draw on when learning to speak. Harder because she knows exactly what she is missing. When she meets Bell, she is frustrated, rebellious, tired of well-meaning teachers who treat her like a child or an invalid. Bell does neither. He treats her like someone capable of anything, someone whose deafness is simply a technical problem to be solved, not a tragedy to be pitied. Their relationship begins as teacher and student but quickly becomes something else. Bell is 26, Mabel is 15. By the standards of the era, this age difference is not scandalous, but there is still a gulf between them, not just of years but of experience, of class, of expectation. Bell is a poor immigrant teacher, living in a boarding house, unknown outside a small circle of educators. Mabel is the daughter of one of Boston's elite, accustomed to servants and fine clothes and social position. Yet they connect across these barriers. Bell discovers that Mabel is sharp, witty, more perceptive than most hearing people he knows. She reads voraciously, writes with elegant clarity, and has opinions about everything from politics to art to the nature of consciousness. And Mabel sees in Bell something her other teachers lack, a kind of burning intensity, a refusal to accept limitations, a belief that the impossible can be made possible through will and work. Their conversations, conducted through lip reading and written notes, range across every subject. Bell tells her about his experiments with sound, about his dream of creating a device that could transmit voices electrically. She listens with genuine interest, asking questions that force him to clarify his thinking. What would such a device look like? How would it work? What would be the first word spoken through it? Bell finds himself explaining his theories to her, and in the process of explaining, he understands them better himself. She becomes his sounding board, his confidant, and slowly, inevitably, something more. He begins to realize that he is falling in love with her, this deaf girl who understands him better than anyone who can hear. But he does not speak of this love, not yet. She is his student. He is poor. Her father would never approve. So he keeps his feelings locked away and channels his passion into his work. Mabel's father, Gardiner Hubbard, is a man who shapes history through money and political influence. He is deeply involved in the telegraph industry, though not as an inventor but as a businessman and reformer. He has spent years fighting against Western Union's monopoly, trying to break their stranglehold on electrical communication. When he learns about Bell's experiments, he sees potential. Not necessarily in the telephone, which still seems like a distant dream, but in something more practical. A multiple telegraph, a device that could send several messages simultaneously over the same wire. If Bell can make sound waves travel through wire, surely he can make multiple telegraph signals travel through the same wire without interfering with each other. This would revolutionize the telegraph industry and break Western Union's power. Hubbard begins to give Bell money, not a fortune, but enough to rent a proper workshop, to buy better materials, to hire an assistant. The assistant's name is Thomas Watson. He is a young mechanic, skilled with tools, practical where Bell is theoretical. Watson works at an electrical shop in Boston, and when Bell comes in looking for someone to help build his devices, Watson volunteers. He is 20 years old, curious, eager to be part of something important. The partnership between Bell and Watson becomes the engine of invention. Bell conceives, Watson builds. Bell explains what he wants, often in abstract terms filled with musical metaphors and acoustic theory, and Watson translates this into wood, wire, and metal. They work together in a cramped attic workshop on Court Street in Boston, surrounded by workbenches, tools, coils of wire, batteries, and the detritus of failed experiments. Their work is tedious, frustrating, punctuated by tiny victories and crushing setbacks. They are trying to do something no one has ever done: convert the complex waveforms of human speech into electrical current, transmit that current through wire, and then convert it back into sound at the other end. The physics involved is staggeringly complicated. Human speech is not a simple tone like a tuning fork. It is a mixture of multiple frequencies layered on top of each other, constantly changing. When you say the word hello, your vocal cords create a fundamental frequency, but also create harmonics, overtones, resonances shaped by your throat, mouth, tongue, and lips. These combined vibrations create a unique sonic fingerprint. To reproduce human speech electrically, Bell needs to capture all of this complexity, preserve it as it travels through wire, and then recreate it with enough fidelity that the output is recognizable as speech. It is like trying to paint a portrait using only binary code. They try hundreds of variations, membranes of different materials and tensions, electromagnets with different numbers of coil windings, different shapes of speaking tubes. Some experiments produce nothing. Others produce clicks, buzzes, or strange musical tones. Once, Watson thinks he hears something that might be speech, but when he asks Bell to repeat it, nothing comes through. Another time, Bell hears a sound that makes his heart race, but he cannot reproduce it. They are chasing ghosts, following hints, building towards something they can feel approaching but cannot quite grasp. The pressure on Bell is immense. He is not just fighting physics, he is fighting time and competition. Alicia Gray is working on similar problems with better funding. Western Union has teams of engineers. Every day that passes without a breakthrough is a day someone else might win the race. Bell begins to suffer from terrible headaches, insomnia, waves of doubt. He wonders if he is wasting his life, chasing an impossible dream. He is 27, 28, 29 years old, still living in cheap boarding houses, still financially dependent on Hubbard's patronage, still unknown. What does he have to show for all this work? A room full of broken machines and notebooks full of failed designs. His friends from university have become doctors, lawyers, professors. They have houses, families, respect. He has wire and magnets and an insane belief that he can make people talk through electricity. But he cannot stop. It is not just about invention anymore, though that is part of it. It is about everything that has driven him since childhood. His mother's deafness, his father's obsession with making the invisible visible, his dead brothers whose voices he can no longer hear, his love for Mabel who cannot hear him tell her he loves her, his rage against silence and separation and the tyranny of distance. The telephone, if he can create it, will be his answer to death, to loss, to every goodbye that cannot be taken back. It will be a way to say, "You are not alone, I am here, I am speaking to you across the void." And then, slowly, the pieces begin to come together. Bell realizes that he has been thinking about the problem incorrectly. He has been trying to reproduce speech perfectly, to capture every nuance. But what if perfection is not necessary? What if the human ear is so good at interpreting sound that it can reconstruct speech from an imperfect signal? After all, we can understand someone speaking in a noisy room, over wind, through a closed door. Our brains fill in gaps, correct distortions, extract meaning from incomplete information. Maybe the telephone does not need to be perfect. It just needs to be good enough. This insight frees Bell to simplify his design, to focus on the essential problem: converting sound into variable electrical current and then back into sound. He experiments with a new type of transmitter, one that uses a membrane attached to a wire that moves in and out of an electromagnetic field. When sound waves hit the membrane, it vibrates, and the wire moves, creating a variable electrical current. This current flows through a wire to a receiver, where it causes another membrane to vibrate in the same pattern, recreating the sound. It is elegant, simple in concept, devilishly difficult in execution. The currents are weak. The membranes are finicky. The slightest misalignment makes everything fail. But Bell feels it in his bones. This is the right path. Through all of this, Mabel remains his constant. She is no longer his student but his equal, his muse, his reason for hope. They exchange letters when they are apart, long letters filled with ideas, feelings, dreams. Bell pours out his heart on paper, telling her about his doubts, his failures, his breakthroughs. She writes back with encouragement, with sharp questions that make him think differently, with a faith in him that he sometimes lacks in himself. Her father watches their growing closeness with mixed feelings. He approves of Bell's intellect, his dedication, his potential. But he also sees a man consumed by an obsession that may never pay off, a man who cannot yet support a wife who may never be able to. Hubbard increases his financial support, but also applies pressure. He wants results. He wants the multiple telegraph, which has clear commercial value. The telephone seems like a distraction, a fantasy. He tells Bell to focus on the practical work, to stop chasing impossibilities. Bell is torn. He needs Hubbard's money. He respects the man's business acumen. But his heart is not in the multiple telegraph. It is a clever device, yes, but it is not transformative. It is incremental improvement, not revolution. The telephone, if he can make it work, will change everything. It will make the telegraph obsolete. It will connect every home, every office, every person. He tries to work on both projects simultaneously, splitting his time, his energy, his focus. But his mind keeps returning to the telephone, to the sound of the human voice traveling through wire, to the dream of speaking and being heard across any distance. He feels he is close, so close. The breakthrough is just one more experiment away, one more adjustment, one more leap of insight. And then, in the winter of 1876, as snow falls on Boston and gas lamps flicker in the windows of his workshop, Bell feels the moment approaching. All his years of study, all his childhood training, all his failures and frustrations and tiny victories are converging toward a single point. He does not know exactly when it will happen, but he knows it will. History is holding its breath. The world is about to change. And Alexander Graham Bell, the poor Scottish teacher who talks to deaf children and dreams impossible dreams, is about to speak the words that will echo through time. The telegraph operators of 1876 are the aristocrats of communication. They sit at their instruments with the confidence of priests translating divine messages, their fingers dancing across brass keys, sending dots and dashes that can coordinate armies, move markets, save lives. They are fast, accurate, indispensable. A skilled operator can send 25 words per minute, earning a salary that makes them middle class, respectable. The telegraph companies that employ them are printing money. Western Union alone handles over 30 million messages per year, charging by the word, building an empire on copper wire and Morse code. This is the future that everyone can see: faster telegraphs, more efficient codes, multiple messages on single wires doubling and tripling capacity. This is where the smart money is investing, where the rational inventors are focusing their efforts. This is what Gardner Hubbard wants Bell to perfect. But Bell is not interested in making the telegraph better. He wants to make it obsolete. He sees the telegraph as a magnificent achievement that is also a dead end, a brilliant solution to yesterday's problem. The telegraph requires trained operators who translate language into code and then back into language. It creates a priesthood of communication, a bottleneck, a class of intermediaries between humans who want to connect. The telegraph is fast, but it is not intimate. You cannot send a laugh through Morse code. You cannot transmit the catch in someone's voice when they are about to cry. You cannot hear the tone that reveals whether "I'm fine" means actually fine or desperately not fine. The telegraph moves words, but Bell wants to move souls. He wants to create a device so simple that anyone can use it, so direct that nothing is lost in translation. He wants to pick up an instrument in Boston and just speak naturally, and have his voice emerge from an identical instrument in New York, San Francisco, London. He wants to eliminate distance entirely, to make geography irrelevant, to turn the whole world into a single room where everyone can hear everyone else. This vision makes him a radical. His colleagues think he is wasting time. Hubbard thinks he is being impractical. Even Watson, his loyal assistant, sometimes questions whether this dream is achievable. The technical challenges are staggering. Sound is vibration of air. Electricity is flow of electrons through metal. How do you translate between these two completely different physical phenomena? How do you capture the infinitely complex waveform of human speech, with all its frequencies and overtones and rapid changes, and encode it as electrical current? And then how do you reverse the process with enough fidelity that the sound remains intelligible? It is like trying to pour water into wire and have it come out the other end still wet. The domains are different. The physics are different. Every scientist Bell consults tells him variations of the same thing. Interesting idea, probably impossible, focus on what's achievable. But Bell has an advantage that borders on the supernatural. He does not just think about sound, he inhabits it. His nervous system seems tuned to frequencies that others cannot perceive. When he listens to a tuning fork, he does not just hear a single note. He hears the complex overtone series, the way the fundamental frequency is accompanied by harmonics at integer multiples. He hears the slow decay of amplitude as the fork loses energy. He can detect variations in pitch that are below the threshold of normal human perception. This is not merely having a good ear. This is synesthesia of sound, a condition where acoustic phenomena translate into something almost visual, something he can manipulate in his mind like a sculptor working with clay. When he conceives of the telephone, he is not making an abstract leap. He is imagining something he can almost hear, almost touch, almost see vibrating in the space between idea and reality. His experiments become increasingly obsessive, increasingly strange. He works 18-hour days, forgetting to eat, sleeping in his workshop when exhaustion finally overtakes him. His clothes smell of solder and acid. His fingers are scarred from burns and cuts. He talks to himself constantly, working through problems aloud, arguing with invisible opponents, explaining his ideas to an audience of tools and wire coils. Watson learns to interpret his moods. When Bell is quiet, it means he is stuck, circling the same problem without finding an exit. When he becomes animated, pacing and gesturing, it means he is onto something. And when he suddenly goes still, staring at nothing, it means an insight is forming, and Watson knows not to interrupt, to let the thought crystallize. They build device after device, each one a variation on the same basic principle. A membrane that vibrates in response to sound. An electromagnetic mechanism that converts those vibrations into electrical current. Wire that carries the current. Another electromagnetic mechanism that converts the current back into vibrations. Another membrane that creates sound. Simple in theory, maddeningly complex in execution. The membranes tear. The electromagnets are too weak or too strong. The wire introduces resistance that dampens the signal. The sounds that emerge are faint, distorted, unrecognizable. They adjust tensions, change materials, reconfigure circuits. Small victories accumulate. One day Watson hears something that might be a vowel sound. Another day, Bell transmits a musical tone clearly enough that Watson can identify the note. But speech, actual intelligible speech, remains out of reach. And all the while the clock is ticking. Bell is not alone in this race, and his competitors are formidable. Elisha Gray is perhaps the most dangerous rival. He is a professional inventor, co-founder of Western Electric, holder of numerous patents. A man who understands both the technical and commercial aspects of innovation. Gray has been experimenting with acoustic telegraphy, devices that use different musical tones to send multiple messages simultaneously. He has also been thinking about speech transmission, working on designs that use a variable resistance transmitter. Gray has resources that Bell lacks: a team of assistants, a proper laboratory, connections to wealthy investors who can fund years of research without results. If Gray files a patent for the telephone before Bell does, it will not matter who thought of it first or who worked harder. Patents go to whoever files first, and Gray is closing in on the same solution. Then there is Thomas Edison, already famous for his work on the telegraph, a relentless experimenter who files patents the way other men breathe. Edison is working on hundreds of projects simultaneously, and while he has not yet focused intensely on the telephone, his genius for practical innovation makes him a constant threat. If Edison decides the telephone is worth pursuing, he will attack the problem with the full force of his laboratory in Menlo Park, testing thousands of materials, brute forcing his way to solutions through sheer volume of experimentation. Edison does not have Bell's theoretical understanding or acoustic sensitivity, but he has something equally valuable: an industrial approach to invention, the ability to scale up production, to find the one working design among 1,000 failures. And lurking in the shadows of history is Antonio Meucci, the forgotten prophet of the telephone. Meucci is an Italian immigrant living in Staten Island, a man who built a crude telephone-like device in the 1850s, years before Bell began his experiments. He called it a teletrafono, used it to communicate between floors of his house, and dreamed of commercializing it. But Meucci is poor, speaks limited English, lacks the connections and money to navigate the patent system effectively. He filed a caveat, a provisional patent placeholder, but could not afford the $10 fee to maintain it annually. His caveat expired. His designs sit in notebooks that few have seen. He has written to telegraph companies, to potential investors, but no one takes him seriously. A poor Italian immigrant claiming to have invented the telephone? In the xenophobic, class-conscious world of 1870s America, Meucci might as well be claiming to have seen God. History will later argue about whether Meucci deserves credit as the true inventor, but in 1876, he is invisible, and invisibility in the world of invention is the same as non-existence. Bell is aware of the competition, feels its pressure like a physical weight. He reads technical journals obsessively, looking for any hint that someone else is close to a breakthrough. He attends lectures and demonstrations, taking notes, assessing the progress of rivals. He knows that Gray is working on similar problems. He knows that Western Union would love to add the telephone to their monopoly. He knows that time is running out, that his window of opportunity is closing. Hubbard keeps pushing him to focus on the multiple telegraph, which is patentable now, which has immediate commercial value. But Bell cannot abandon the telephone. It has become more than a project. It is his obsession, his destiny, his way of answering all the silence that has haunted his life. In the spring of 1876, Bell makes a decision that will determine everything. He decides to file a patent application for the telephone, even though he has not yet made it work properly. This is an enormous risk. Patent law requires that an invention be proven to work. If Bell files and then cannot demonstrate a working telephone, his patent could be invalidated. But if he waits until he has perfected the device, someone else might file first. It is a calculated gamble, and Bell decides to take it. On February 14, 1876, Valentine's Day, his lawyer files the patent application at the United States Patent Office in Washington, D.C. The application describes the principle of variable resistance transmission, the use of undulating current to represent speech, the basic architecture of what will become the telephone. It is broad enough to cover multiple implementations, specific enough to be defensible, brilliant in its legal construction. What Bell does not know, cannot know, is that Elisha Gray walks into the same patent office on the same day, just hours later, to file a caveat for his own telephone design. Gray's design uses liquid resistance, a different technical approach, but achieves the same goal: transmitting speech electrically. The two men, working independently, driven by the same dream, arrive at the threshold of invention within hours of each other. History will turn on this accident of timing. Bell's application is numbered patent number 174,465. It will become one of the most valuable patents ever issued, worth billions in today's currency, the foundation of an industry that will reshape civilization. But on February 14, 1876, it is just a stack of papers in a government office, untested, unproven, a promise without a working prototype. Now Bell faces a new pressure. He has claimed to have invented the telephone. He must prove it. The patent office will eventually ask for a demonstration. More importantly, Hubbard and his other backers will want to see results, to know that their investment has yielded something real. Bell returns to his workshop with renewed urgency. The patent application has bought him time, but not much. He needs a breakthrough, and he needs it soon. He goes back to fundamentals, questioning every assumption. The problem with his current design is that the electrical current is too weak and too constant. Sound is variation. A pure tone is a regular oscillation. Speech is complex, irregular variation. To transmit speech, he needs to create electrical current that varies in exact proportion to the sound waves hitting the transmitter. This is called undulating current, and it is devilishly hard to achieve. The electromagnets he has been using create current that is either on or off, strong or weak, but not smoothly variable. He needs a different approach, a way to make resistance vary continuously in response to sound. This is when Bell begins experimenting with liquid transmitters. The idea is elegantly simple but difficult to execute. Take a shallow dish filled with acidic liquid, something that conducts electricity. Attach a wire to a needle or probe that hangs above the liquid, not quite touching it. When sound waves hit a membrane attached to the probe, the membrane vibrates, causing the probe to move up and down, moving closer to and farther from the liquid. When the probe dips into the liquid even slightly, it completes a circuit, and the depth of the dip determines the resistance. More depth means more current, less depth means less current. The sound waves, by vibrating the membrane and probe, create continuously variable current that corresponds to the acoustic waveform. In theory, this undulating current can then flow through wire to a receiver, where it powers an electromagnet that vibrates another membrane in the same pattern, recreating the sound. Bell and Watson build prototype after prototype of liquid transmitters. They try different liquids: water mixed with sulfuric acid, salt water, various chemical solutions. They try different probes: needles, wires, metal strips. They try different membrane materials and tensions. The workshop becomes a bizarre laboratory, part physics experiment, part alchemy, filled with beakers and batteries and the smell of acid. Bell's hands are constantly stained with chemicals. He burns himself repeatedly, splashing acid on his clothes, his skin, his precious notebooks. But slowly, incrementally, the device begins to work. Not reliably, not well, but it works. Watson, listening at the receiver in another room, begins to hear sounds that are unmistakably vocal, though still too distorted to understand as words. The spring of 1876 is a time of manic experimentation. Bell barely sleeps. His health deteriorates. He develops stress-related ailments, headaches, stomach problems, a nervous tremor in his hands. Mabel writes him concerned letters, begging him to rest, to eat properly, to remember that his life matters more than his invention. But Bell cannot stop. He is so close. He can feel it. Every failed experiment teaches him something. Every small success shows him the path forward. He is like a man climbing a mountain in fog, unable to see the summit, but knowing that each step upward brings him closer. His relationship with sound becomes even more intense during this period. He spends hours just listening, training his ear to detect the finest variations in tone and timbre. He conducts experiments on himself, speaking into his devices at different pitches and volumes, trying to understand which frequencies transmit best, which get lost or distorted. He discovers that the human voice is most intelligible in a narrow frequency range, roughly 100 to 3000 Hz, and that if his telephone can reproduce just this range, it will be sufficient for conversation, even if the full richness of the voice is lost. This is a crucial insight. The telephone does not need to be perfect, does not need to reproduce music or capture every nuance. It just needs to be good enough for two people to understand each other. Perfect fidelity is the enemy of practical invention. Good enough is the doorway to revolution. Watson becomes more than an assistant during this period. He becomes a collaborator, a partner, almost a brother. The two men develop an intuitive understanding of each other. Watson can anticipate what Bell needs before Bell asks for it. Bell can communicate complex technical ideas with a few words and a sketch, trusting Watson to fill in the details. They argue sometimes about designs, about approaches, about whether something is worth trying or a waste of time. But the arguments are productive, each man pushing the other to think more clearly, to question assumptions, to not settle for easy answers. Their workshop becomes a world unto itself, separated from ordinary life by walls of obsession and purpose. Outside, the city goes about its business. People work, eat, sleep, fall in love, die. Inside, Bell and Watson are trying to change the relationship between space and presence, to make geography obsolete, to give humanity a new sense organ for reaching across distance. And then comes March 10, 1876. A Wednesday. The day that will be remembered as the birth of the telephone, though like all births, it is messy, accidental, tinged with pain. Bell and Watson are working in their Court Street workshop. They have set up their latest liquid transmitter design. Bell is in one room, Watson in another, door closed, with wire running between the two rooms carrying the electrical connection. They have done this dozens of times before, testing, adjusting, failing, trying again. But today something is different. Bell has been adjusting the liquid level in the transmitter, trying to get the probe depth exactly right. He is using acidic water, sulfuric acid mixed with water in a shallow dish, and he is being careless because he is tired, because he has done this 1,000 times, because his mind is focused on the technical problem rather than basic safety. And then it happens. Bell knocks over the dish. Acid splashes onto his clothes, onto his skin. It burns. The pain is immediate and sharp. Without thinking, acting on pure instinct, Bell calls out for help. "Mr. Watson, come here, I want to see you." Just a simple sentence, spoken in a moment of distress, the most natural thing in the world. A man hurt, calling for assistance. Nothing special about the words. Everything special about what happens next. Because in the other room, Watson hears them. Not through the air, not through the walls, but through the wire. The voice comes out of the receiver, thin and tinny and distorted, but unmistakably a human voice, unmistakably words, unmistakably Bell. Watson's heart stops. He understands instantly what has just occurred. He runs from the receiver room, bursts through the door, finds Bell dabbing at acid burns on his clothes, and says the words that both men will remember for the rest of their lives. "Mr. Bell, I heard you. I could hear what you said." The moment is not dramatic in the way Hollywood would later portray it. There is no triumphant music, no slow-motion realization, no profound statement about the future of humanity. There are just two men in a cluttered workshop, one with acid-stained trousers, both breathing hard, both trying to process what has just happened. They repeat the experiment immediately, of course. Bell speaks into the transmitter again, deliberately this time, and Watson listens. The words come through, garbled but recognizable. They switch positions. Watson speaks, Bell listens. It works. It actually works. The human voice is traveling through wire, converted to electricity and back to sound, crossing distance without delay, without operators, without code. The impossible has become real. They work through the night, too excited to sleep, testing and retesting, documenting everything, making sure it is not a fluke. The liquid transmitter is crude, impractical, requires constant adjustment. The sound quality is poor. But none of that matters. The principle works. Human speech can be transmitted electrically. The telephone exists. Everything else is just engineering, just improvement, just iteration. Bell and Watson have crossed the threshold between imagination and reality, and there is no going back. In the days following that first transmission, Bell and Watson exist in a state of euphoric exhaustion. They know what they have achieved, but they also know that knowing is not enough. The world will not believe them without proof, without demonstration, without the telephone becoming something more than two men shouting into wire in a cramped workshop. The liquid transmitter works, but it is temperamental, requires constant adjustment, leaks, corrodes, fills the room with acid fumes. It is not a product. It is barely a prototype. It is proof of concept, nothing more. But proof of concept is everything. It means the dream is not insane. It means the laws of physics cooperate. It means that somewhere in the space of possible inventions, a practical telephone exists, and Bell now knows the path to reach it. The patent he filed in February suddenly becomes valuable in a way that Bell himself could not have fully imagined when he submitted it. That document, written before he had a working device, describes the principles that he has now proven. It covers the use of undulating current, the conversion of acoustic vibrations into variable electrical resistance, the transmission and reconversion at the receiving end. Gray's caveat, filed the same day, describes similar principles but lacks the legal weight of a full patent application. When the Patent Office eventually rules on the competing claims, they will award the patent to Bell based on the technicality of filing order and the completeness of his application. This decision will be challenged, fought over in court for years, spawning lawsuits that will become legendary in patent law. But for now, in March 1876, Bell has something more important than legal documents. He has a working telephone. He writes to his parents in Canada, barely able to contain his excitement. The letter is filled with technical details but also with a sense of wonder, of disbelief at what has been achieved. His father, Alexander Melville Bell, responds with cautious pride. He has seen his son obsess over this project for years, has worried about his health, his finances, his future. But he has also never doubted that Alec possesses unusual gifts. The father's own work with visible speech, his lifetime of studying how humans produce and perceive sound, has prepared him to understand the magnitude of what his son has done. This is not just an invention. It is a fundamental change in human communication, comparable to the invention of writing, of printing, of any technology that expands the reach of human consciousness. Bell writes to Mabel as well, and here his letters take on a different tone. The technical excitement is still present, but underneath it runs a deeper current. He writes about what the telephone means beyond mechanics and patents. He writes about connection, about the ability to hear someone's voice when they are far away, about how this invention is, in a sense, an answer to her deafness. He cannot make her hear through her ears, but perhaps he can create a world where voice travels through new channels, where communication happens through devices that amplify and transform, where the barriers between people become thinner. Mabel reads these letters and understands what he is really saying, that his entire project, his entire obsession, has been shaped by loving someone he cannot speak to in the conventional way. The telephone is, among other things, a love letter written in copper wire and electromagnetic fields. But love and invention must now give way to demonstration and commercialization. Gardiner Hubbard, Mabel's father and Bell's financial backer, immediately understands the commercial implications. If the telephone works, if it can be made reliable and practical, it will not just compete with the telegraph. It will replace it. Why send messages in code through operators when you can simply talk? The telephone will be to the telegraph what the locomotive was to the horse cart. Not just faster but fundamentally different, a technology that changes everything it touches. Hubbard begins planning how to present the telephone to the world, how to generate interest, how to attract investors who can provide the capital needed to manufacture and distribute the device at scale. The opportunity comes in the form of the Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia, the great World's Fair celebrating the 100th anniversary of American independence. Opening in May 1876, the exhibition is a showcase of human achievement, a vast collection of inventions, artworks, industrial products, and cultural displays from around the world. Millions will attend. Judges will award prizes for the most significant innovations. This is where Bell must present the telephone, where he must prove to scientists, engineers, investors, and the public that his invention is real and revolutionary. Hubbard secures space for Bell to exhibit, though it is not a prominent location. The telephone is lumped in with other electrical curiosities, competing for attention with hundreds of other inventions, most of which will be forgotten by history. Bell travels to Philadelphia in June, bringing Watson and several telephone prototypes. He is nervous, unwell, suffering from the accumulated stress of months of overwork. The exhibition is overwhelming. Enormous buildings filled with machinery, noise, crowds, heat. Alexander Graham Bell is just one inventor among hundreds, most of whom have more impressive displays, more backing, more confidence. He sets up his equipment in a small area, running wires between 2 points so that visitors can speak into one end and listen at the other. But in the chaos of the exhibition, with thousands of competing sights and sounds, the telephone seems almost quaint. People walk past without stopping. Those who do stop often do not understand what they are looking at. A device for talking through wires? But we already have the telegraph. What is the point? The breakthrough comes not from the general public but from a group of judges touring the exhibition to award prizes for innovation. Among them is Emperor Dom Pedro II of Brazil, a man with a deep interest in science and technology, known for personally visiting inventors and supporting new ideas. The judges are tired, moving through exhibits mechanically, checking boxes. They approach Bell's display with little enthusiasm, ready to spend a few polite minutes and move on. But Dom Pedro recognizes Bell. The emperor had previously visited the Boston School for the Deaf and watched Bell teach. He remembers the young Scottish teacher who worked with deaf children, and he is curious about what this teacher is now doing with electrical equipment. Bell, exhausted and discouraged, rallies himself to demonstrate the telephone. He explains the principle, then takes the emperor to the receiving end while Bell himself goes to the transmitter. And then Bell does something unexpected. Instead of reciting the alphabet or speaking test phrases, he begins to recite Shakespeare. Hamlet's soliloquy. To be or not to be, that is the question. The words flow through the wire, transmitted as undulating electrical current, reconverted to sound at the receiver. And Dom Pedro, listening, hears them. Hears Bell's voice reciting Shakespeare through a device that should not be possible. The emperor drops the receiver in astonishment and exclaims, "My God, it talks!" This moment changes everything. The other judges crowd around, demanding to try the device themselves. Word spreads through the exhibition. Newspapers pick up the story. The telephone goes from obscure curiosity to sensation overnight. Suddenly everyone wants to see it, to try it, to understand how it works. Bell finds himself explaining the same principles dozens of times per day, demonstrating the device until his voice is hoarse. Scientists examine his equipment, ask technical questions, debate the underlying physics. Some are skeptical, convinced there must be some trick, some hidden mechanism. But the telephone is too simple to fake. The principles are transparent. You speak into one end, and your voice emerges from the other. It is not magic. It is physics applied with insight and persistence. The judges award Bell the Centennial Exhibition's Gold Medal for electrical equipment. The award comes with prestige but little money. What it does provide is legitimacy. Bell is no longer a poor Scottish teacher with a crazy idea. He is an award-winning inventor whose device has been validated by international scientific authorities. Newspapers begin to publish articles about the telephone, though many are confused about what it is or why it matters. Some describe it as an improved telegraph. Others call it a toy, a novelty with no practical application. A few, more prescient, recognize it as something transformative. But even they cannot fully imagine what is coming, how thoroughly the telephone will reshape human society. Bell returns to Boston exhausted but validated. The question now is how to move from demonstration to distribution, from prototype to product. This is where Bell's limitations become apparent. He is an inventor, a teacher, a visionary, but he is not a businessman. He does not know how to manufacture devices at scale, how to build distribution networks, how to market products, how to raise capital. He needs partners, and fortunately, Gardner Hubbard is exactly the kind of partner required. Hubbard is a lawyer, a businessman, a political operator who understands how to navigate the complex world of commerce and regulation. He begins assembling what will become the Bell Telephone Company, recruiting investors, filing additional patents, planning the infrastructure needed to make telephony a commercial reality. But commercialization requires more than business acumen. It requires a better telephone. The liquid transmitter that Bell used for his demonstrations is impractical for everyday use. It leaks, requires maintenance, degrades quickly. Bell and Watson go back to the workshop to design something more robust. They experiment with electromagnetic transmitters, with different membrane materials, with various receiver designs. Progress is slow. Every improvement in one aspect seems to create problems in another. Making the device more sensitive makes it more fragile. Making it more durable makes it less sensitive. The sound quality remains poor by modern standards, thin and tinny, requiring listeners to concentrate hard to understand words. But it is enough. People can communicate. Voices can cross distance. The rest is iteration. During this period, Thomas Edison enters the picture. Edison, already famous for his telegraph work, sees the telephone's potential and begins developing his own version. Edison's genius is different from Bell's. Where Bell approaches invention through theory and acoustic understanding, Edison approaches it through brute force experimentation. He tests hundreds of materials for transmitter diaphragms, trying metal, wood, paper, leather, searching for the combination that produces the clearest sound. He discovers that using carbon granules as a variable resistor produces much better results than Bell's designs. Edison's carbon transmitter becomes the standard, vastly improving the telephone's sound quality and reliability. Bell's patent covers the basic principle of telephony, but Edison's improvements make it practical. The two men will spend years in patent disputes, fighting over who invented what, who deserves credit, who should profit. History will remember Bell as the inventor of the telephone, but Edison's contributions are nearly as important. The first telephone networks begin to emerge in 1877, just a year after the Centennial Exhibition. They are small, local, experimental. A few dozen wealthy individuals or businesses in Boston, New York, Philadelphia install telephones, connecting to small central switchboards operated by young women who manually plug and unplug wires to connect calls. The first telephone operators are mainly teenage girls, chosen because they have nimble fingers, good hearing, and are thought to be more patient and polite than men. These operators become the nervous system of the early telephone network, literally holding the wires that connect people, listening in on conversations, knowing everyone's business. Privacy is not even a consideration in these early days. The miracle is connection, not confidentiality. The experience of using an early telephone is both thrilling and frustrating. The sound quality is poor. Voices are faint, distorted, accompanied by crackling and buzzing. Users must shout to be heard. Conversations are stilted, unnatural. People do not yet know how to talk on the telephone. They treat it like a telegraph, speaking in short, formal phrases. Good morning, stop. I am calling to inquire about the shipment, stop. It takes time for telephone etiquette to develop, for people to learn that they can speak normally, that they can have actual conversations, that the telephone is not just for business messages but for chatting, for sharing news, for maintaining relationships across distance. The social impact begins almost immediately, though few recognize it at first. In cities where telephones are installed, the pace of life accelerates. Business decisions that once took days, requiring written correspondence and messengers, can now be made in minutes. Doctors can be summoned quickly in emergencies. Fire departments can be alerted before flames consume entire blocks. The telephone does not just speed up existing processes. It enables entirely new ways of organizing society. Companies can centralize operations because managers can coordinate with distant branches by phone. Families can stay connected as children move away for work or education. Courtship changes as young men can call their sweethearts instead of writing letters or visiting in person. But the growth is slow at first. Telephones are expensive, affordable only to the wealthy and to businesses. The infrastructure is limited. Outside major cities, telephone service does not exist. Many people remain skeptical. Why pay for a telephone when you can send a telegram or write a letter? What is the point of talking to someone you cannot see? The telephone seems like a luxury, a toy for the rich, not a necessity. Some critics argue that it will never be profitable, that the market is too small, that the telegraph companies are too entrenched. They are wrong, spectacularly wrong, but their skepticism reflects the genuine difficulty of imagining how a new technology will be used once it escapes the control of its inventors and enters the wild creativity of human culture. Bell himself is increasingly peripheral to the telephone's commercial development. He has married Mabel Hubbard in July 1877, a wedding delayed by his poverty until the telephone's success made him financially viable in her father's eyes. The marriage is happy, tender, built on genuine understanding and shared values. Mabel becomes his anchor, his refuge from the commercial battles that now swirl around the telephone. She manages their household, raises their children, and provides emotional support as Bell struggles with the gap between his inventor's idealism and the harsh realities of business. Bell wants the telephone to be a tool for human connection, affordable and accessible to everyone. But the investors and businessmen who now control the Bell Telephone Company want profit, market dominance, monopoly. They see the telephone as they see any other commodity, something to be owned, controlled, exploited for maximum financial return. The patent wars begin in earnest. Western Union, realizing they have missed the opportunity to control the telephone, forms a competing company using Edison's improved transmitters and Elisha Gray's receiver designs. They argue that Bell's patent is invalid, that he did not have a working device when he filed, that others deserve credit for the invention. The legal battles are complex, expensive, exhausting. Bell spends months giving depositions, testifying in court, watching lawyers argue over technical details that he understands in ways they never will. He hates it, this reduction of his vision to legal maneuvering and financial calculation. But he endures because losing means losing control of his invention, means seeing it disappear into Western Union's monopoly, means betraying Watson and Hubbard and everyone who believed in him. The courts ultimately rule in Bell's favor, upholding his patent as valid and comprehensive. This decision is one of the most important in patent law history, establishing precedents that will govern intellectual property disputes for generations. But the victory is bittersweet for Bell. He wins the legal right to control the telephone, but in winning he also commits himself to a life of corporate leadership, stockholder meetings, business strategy, all the things he never wanted. The Bell Telephone Company grows into a behemoth, eventually becoming American Telephone and Telegraph, AT&T, one of the largest and most powerful corporations in the world. Bell himself becomes wealthy beyond his childhood dreams, famous, respected, honored with medals and degrees and invitations to speak before kings and presidents. But fame and fortune bring their own burdens. Bell is pursued by lawsuits, not just from Western Union but from countless small inventors who claim they invented the telephone first, who demand recognition, money, credit. Antonio Mussi's supporters file suit on his behalf, arguing that the poor Italian immigrant was the true inventor, that Bell stole his ideas. The case drags on for years, never fully resolved before Mussi's death. History will debate the question endlessly: who really invented the telephone? Was it Bell with his patent and his demonstrations? Was it Mussi with his earlier devices and his poverty? Was it Gray who filed his caveat the same day as Bell's patent? Was it Edison whose improvements made the device practical? The answer is both simple and complex. Bell filed the patent that mattered, built the device that convinced the world, and created the mythology that endures. Whether he deserves sole credit is a different question, one that speaks to how we mythologize invention, reducing complex collaborative processes to individual genius, creating heroes when the reality is usually more collective, more ambiguous, more human. Bell begins to retreat from the telephone business as soon as he can. He sells much of his stock, provides for his family's financial security, and then turns his attention elsewhere. He returns to his first love, helping the deaf. He establishes organizations, funds research, advocates for educational methods that allow deaf children to integrate into hearing society. This work brings him back into contact with Helen Keller, who becomes one of his closest friends. Their relationship is extraordinary. The deaf-blind woman who learned to communicate through touch, and the man who invented a device for transmitting voices through wire, finding in each other a shared understanding of what it means to bridge seemingly unbridgeable gaps. Bell also pursues dozens of other inventions. Work on aircraft, on hydrofoil boats, on devices for detecting metal in human bodies, on methods for desalinating seawater. He is constitutionally incapable of not inventing, not experimenting, not pushing at the boundaries of what is possible. Meanwhile, the telephone spreads across America, then across the world. Telephone lines web cities, connecting homes and businesses into networks of conversation. Central switchboards grow larger, employing thousands of operators who sit at enormous panels, plugging and unplugging calls, saying "number please" hundreds of times per day. The operators are almost exclusively women, paid poorly, subjected to strict rules about behavior and speech, yet they become essential infrastructure, the human components in a machine for connecting other humans. Telephone etiquette develops. People learn to say hello when answering, a word that was rarely used before the telephone made it the standard greeting. They learn to identify themselves, to speak clearly, to wait their turn in conversation. The telephone creates new social anxieties. The fear of calls at odd hours, the uncertainty about who might be on the other end, the invasion of domestic space by distant voices. By the 1890s, less than 20 years after Bell's first successful transmission, there are hundreds of thousands of telephones in use. By the early 1900s, there are millions. The growth is exponential, unstoppable. Rural areas demand service, leading to the construction of vast networks of poles and wires crisscrossing farmland. International cables are laid, allowing calls between continents, first across the Atlantic, then the Pacific. The world shrinks. A businessman in New York can speak to a partner in London without leaving his office. A mother can call her daughter who has moved to another state, hearing her voice on her birthday, bridging distance with sound. The telephone does not just change communication. It changes the texture of daily life, the feeling of connection, the experience of being human in an increasingly interconnected world. But this connection comes at a cost. The telephone, like all technologies, is neutral in itself but shaped by the uses to which it is put. It connects lovers but also enables criminals to coordinate. It speeds business but also accelerates market panics. During World War I, military commanders used telephones to coordinate attacks, to move troops, to orchestrate slaughter at a scale that would have been impossible without instant communication. Telephone lines are tapped by intelligence services, conversations intercepted, privacy eroded. The device that Bell imagined as a tool for human connection becomes also a tool for surveillance, control, and violence. This is the paradox of progress. Every technology that brings us together also creates new ways to harm each other. Every increase in power is an increase in the power to do good and the power to do evil. Bell lives long enough to see this duality, to understand that his invention has unleashed forces he cannot control, consequences he could not have foreseen. He spends his later years at his estate in Nova Scotia, on Cape Breton Island, in a place called Bainbrig, beautiful mountain in Gaelic. The estate becomes his laboratory, his refuge, his place of peace. He fills it with experiments, with students and assistants, with the latest scientific instruments. He flies kites, enormous tetrahedral structures that he believes will unlock the secrets of flight. He builds experimental aircraft, boats, devices whose purposes are known only to himself. He walks the cliffs overlooking the Atlantic Ocean, the same ocean he crossed as a young man fleeing the deaths of his brothers, and he thinks about sound, about distance, about the voices of the dead that he will never hear again. The telephone has made him immortal in the eyes of history, but it cannot bring back his brothers, cannot let him speak one more time to everyone he has lost. The 20th century arrives, and with it, a world that Alexander Graham Bell barely recognizes. The telephone, his invention, his dream made tangible, has escaped his control entirely and become something vast, impersonal, corporate. American Telephone and Telegraph, the company that bears his name, is no longer a business. It is an empire. It controls millions of telephone lines, employs hundreds of thousands of workers, possesses wealth that rivals small nations. The company's headquarters in New York are temples of capitalism, marble and steel monuments to the power of monopoly. Executives in expensive suits make decisions that affect millions of lives, deciding who gets telephone service and who does not, setting rates, crushing competitors, buying politicians, shaping regulations. And somewhere in the corporate paperwork, in the stock certificates and annual reports, Alexander Graham Bell's name appears, but the man himself is absent, deliberately, gratefully absent. Bell's relationship with his own fame is complicated, painful, shot through with ambivalence. He is celebrated everywhere he goes, introduced at dinners and conferences as the man who invented the telephone, who connected humanity, who conquered distance. Medals accumulate in drawers. Universities grant him honorary degrees, scrolls of recognition that gather dust. Governments award him orders and commendations. He is invited to meet presidents, kings, industrial titans. Everywhere he goes, people want to shake his hand, to hear the story of that first transmission, to ask him what he thinks the future holds. And Bell endures these encounters with a kind of weary grace, knowing that the person they are honoring is not quite him, not the real him, but rather a simplified version, a hero reduced to a single achievement, a complex life flattened into an anecdote about spilled acid and a voice through wire. The truth is more complicated than the legend. Bell knows, even if history does not always acknowledge, that the telephone was not created by one man in one moment. It was created by his father's work on visible speech, by his mother's deafness, by Watson's mechanical skill, by Hubbard's financial backing, by Mabel's love and faith, by the collective knowledge of physics and engineering that preceded him, by the failed experiments of Mussey and the near-simultaneous work of Gray, by Edison's improvements and the innovations of hundreds of engineers who refined the device into something practical. Bell's genius was real, his contribution undeniable, but genius does not work in isolation. It builds on foundations laid by others, draws from cultural contexts, emerges from networks of collaboration that history later erases in favor of singular narratives. Bell understands this, feels uncomfortable with the mythology that surrounds him, but he also knows that myths serve purposes, that societies need heroes, and that fighting against one's own legend is exhausting and ultimately futile. What truly burdens Bell is not the fame itself but the legal warfare that accompanies it. The telephone, because it is so valuable, attracts lawsuits like blood attracts sharks. In the years following his patent award, Bell and his company face more than 600 separate legal challenges. 600. Each one claiming that Bell's patent is invalid, that someone else invented the telephone first, that the patent office made errors, that Bell committed fraud. Some of these suits are legitimate disagreements about technical priority and intellectual property. Others are transparent attempts at extortion, chancers hoping to extract settlement money from a wealthy corporation rather than prove their cases in court. And a few are tragic, brought by genuine inventors who worked on similar problems, who came close to the same solutions, but who lost the race by days or weeks or months, and who now watch Bell reap all the glory and profit while they die in obscurity and poverty. The most painful of these legal battles involves Antonio Mussey. Mussey's story haunts Bell because it contains an uncomfortable truth, that invention is often a matter of luck, timing, and circumstance as much as genius. Mussey really did build telephone-like devices in the 1850s. He really did demonstrate them to potential investors. He really did file a caveat with the patent office. But he was poor, Italian, an immigrant in a xenophobic society, unable to afford the fees to maintain his caveat, unable to hire lawyers to fight for his rights. When Western Union later sues Bell, they bring Mussi in as evidence, parading the old man through depositions and courtrooms, using his poverty and failure as a weapon against Bell's success. The case becomes absurd, both sides arguing not about technical merit but about timing, about paperwork, about who said what to whom and when. Mussi dies in 1889 before the case is resolved, and his death removes any emotional satisfaction Bell might have felt from winning. Instead, Bell is left with the knowledge that history is written by the winners, but the winners are not always the most deserving, just the most fortunate. Elisha Gray's legal challenges are more substantial because Gray really was working on the telephone independently, really did arrive at the patent office on the same day as Bell, really did have designs that could have worked. The legal battle between Gray and Bell stretches for years, involving testimony from dozens of witnesses, technical analysis of patent documents, arguments about the nature of invention itself. Gray supporters claim he was robbed, that Bell's lawyers somehow got advanced knowledge of Gray's caveat and incorporated its ideas into Bell's patent application. Bell supporters insist that Bell worked independently, that the simultaneity of their filings proves only that the time was ripe for the invention, that multiple people were converging on the same solution. The courts ultimately rule in Bell's favor, but the victory feels hollow. Gray never stops believing he was cheated, and some historians agree with him, though others do not. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle, lost in the complexity of overlapping ideas and the imperfect process by which societies assign credit for innovation. Bell grows to hate lawyers, hate courtrooms, hate the endless depositions where he must explain technical details to men who do not understand physics, who care only about narrow legal definitions and procedural technicalities. He sits in witness chairs for hours, days, weeks cumulative, answering the same questions repeatedly, forced to defend not just his patent but his integrity, his honesty, his right to be called an inventor. The opposing attorneys try to paint him as a fraud, a charlatan, a man who stole ideas from others. They interrogate his notebooks, looking for inconsistencies. They question his assistants, his backers, his family. They dig into his personal life, his correspondence with Mabel, his teaching methods, searching for anything that might discredit him. It is brutal, dehumanizing, a process that reduces human creativity to legal combat. The stress affects Bell's health. He develops insomnia, lying awake at night replaying courtroom exchanges, worrying about upcoming testimony, imagining worst-case scenarios where his patent is invalidated and everything he has built collapses. He suffers from what we would now recognize as anxiety and depression, though the 19th century lacks language for these conditions. His doctors prescribe rest, travel, changes of scenery. Mabel watches her husband deteriorate under the pressure and does what she can to shield him, to create spaces of peace in their home, to remind him that he is more than the telephone, more than the legal battles, more than the public persona. She is his refuge, his reminder that life contains joys beyond invention and commerce. Through all of this, the telephone itself continues to spread, indifferent to the human dramas of its creation. By 1900, there are over 1 million telephones in the United States alone. By 1910, there are 7 million. The growth is exponential, transformative. Telephone poles become a ubiquitous feature of urban and rural landscapes, forests of wood and wire carrying voices across continent and ocean. The operators, those thousands of young women who manually connect calls at switchboards, develop their own culture, their own jargon, their own understanding of the system they animate. They are overworked, underpaid, strictly supervised, forbidden from eavesdropping, though they inevitably hear everything. They know who is having affairs, who is going bankrupt, who is sick, who is dying. They are the nervous system of their communities, connecting people but also bearing the weight of those connections, the loneliness and desperation and joy that flow through the wires they manipulate. The telephone changes courtship, allowing young men to call young women without the formal rituals of parlor visits and chaperones. It changes business, making markets more efficient but also more volatile, allowing faster responses to opportunity and disaster alike. It changes politics as candidates can coordinate campaigns across vast territories, as news spreads faster, as scandals erupt and spread before they can be contained. It changes the experience of family as children can call home from distant cities, as grandparents can hear grandchildren's voices without traveling, as the very definition of staying in touch shifts from letters and visits to regular phone conversations. The telephone does not just transmit voices. It transmits presence, emotion, urgency, intimacy. It collapses distance in a way that telegrams never could, creating an illusion of proximity that is both comforting and unsettling. But the telephone also creates new forms of inequality and exclusion. Not everyone can afford one. Rural areas lag behind cities in service availability. The telephone network becomes a map of social and economic power, with some neighborhoods thick with connections while others remain isolated. Race and class determine who gets service and who does not. In the American South, segregation extends to telephone networks, with separate exchanges for white and black customers. The telephone, like the railroad and the factory before it, becomes both a tool of progress and a mechanism for reinforcing existing hierarchies. Bell himself, working with deaf children, passionate about education and inclusion, never intended this. But intention does not control outcome. Technologies acquire meanings and uses that their creators never imagined, shaped by the societies that adopt them, reflecting and amplifying those societies' values, prejudices, and structures of power. The corporate entity that grows from Bell's invention, AT&T, becomes one of the most powerful monopolies in American history. The company argues that telephone service is a natural monopoly, that competition would be wasteful and inefficient, that everyone benefits from a single integrated network. And there is truth to this argument. A telephone is only useful if it can connect to other telephones, and the more telephones in a network, the more valuable each individual telephone becomes. This is called network effects, and it creates powerful incentives toward monopoly. But monopoly also means market power, the ability to set prices without competition, to deny service to unprofitable areas, to prioritize wealthy customers over poor ones. AT&T becomes a state within a state, operating under special regulatory arrangements that grant it monopoly status in exchange for universal service obligations. It is capitalism and socialism intertwined, private ownership serving public purposes under government oversight, a compromise that will last for most of the 20th century before eventually unraveling. Bell watches all of this from an increasing distance. He remains a stockholder, attends occasional board meetings, lends his name to company initiatives. But his heart is no longer in it. The telephone business has become something he does not recognize, something that operates according to logics of profit and market share and regulatory arbitrage that bore him and depress him. He is an inventor, not a businessman. He dreams in sound waves and mechanical linkages, not in quarterly earnings and stock prices. The telephone was his answer to silence, his way of connecting people he loved, his bridge between the deaf world of his mother and the hearing world of everyone else. That it has become a tool of corporate empire is both inevitable and tragic, the price paid for bringing any powerful technology into a world organized around competition and accumulation. So Bell retreats. Not from the world entirely, but from the telephone world, from the corporate battles and legal warfare and public adulation that come with being the famous inventor. He retreats to Bainbrig, his estate in Nova Scotia, a vast property overlooking the Bras d'Or Lake, mountains and water and sky that remind him of his Scottish childhood. The estate becomes his laboratory, his playground, his refuge. He fills it with students and assistants, young engineers and scientists drawn by the chance to work with the great Alexander Graham Bell, though they quickly discover that the man himself is more interested in their ideas than in his own fame. He creates an atmosphere of intellectual freedom, encouraging wild speculation, tolerating failure, celebrating curiosity for its own sake. This is the world Bell loves, not the world of patents and profits but the world of wonder and investigation. At Bainbridge, Bell returns to pure research, to the questions that fascinate him regardless of commercial application. He becomes obsessed with flight. The Wright brothers have proven that heavier-than-air flight is possible, and now Bell wants to understand its principles, to push its boundaries, to imagine what comes next. He designs and builds enormous tetrahedral kites, structures made of thousands of triangular cells, geometric forms that he believes combine strength with lightness. These kites are beautiful, strange objects, like crystalline clouds, and Bell flies them from the hills of his estate, watching them soar on Atlantic winds, collecting data on lift and drag and structural integrity. His neighbors think he is crazy, this famous inventor flying giant kites like a child. But Bell does not care about their opinions. He is doing what he has always done, pursuing understanding, chasing insights about how the physical world works. He forms the Aerial Experiment Association with a group of young aviators and engineers, including Glenn Curtiss and Casey Baldwin, funding their work, providing facilities and encouragement. Together they design and build aircraft, test engines, study propeller designs, crash repeatedly and rebuild. Bell himself never flies, he is too old, too heavy, too cautious. But he orchestrates, advises, participates intellectually. The group achieves several aviation firsts, including the first public flight in Canada and innovations in aircraft control surfaces. When the association dissolves after a few years, its members scatter to found companies and continue aviation work that will shape the 20th century. Bell's direct contribution to flight is modest compared to his contribution to telephony, but his role in fostering innovation, in creating spaces where young people can experiment and fail and learn, is perhaps more important than any specific invention. He also pursues work on hydrofoil boats, vessels that rise above the water on submerged wings, reducing drag and increasing speed. This work combines his love of physics with his love of the sea, the water that surrounds his estate, the same water he crossed as a young immigrant. His hydrofoil designs eventually achieve world speed records, proving the concept's viability. He experiments with desalination, trying to solve the problem of converting seawater to freshwater, believing this could alleviate suffering in arid regions. He works on methods for detecting icebergs, motivated by the Titanic disaster, trying to use sound waves to locate obstacles in darkness and fog. He develops breathing devices, hoping to save miners trapped underground. He invents the photophone, a device that transmits sound on beams of light, a precursor to fiber optic communication, though the technology is too primitive to be practical in his lifetime. Through all of this diverse work, Bell is driven by the same impulse that led him to invent the telephone: the desire to solve problems that cause human suffering, to make the impossible possible, to understand and manipulate the physical world in service of connection and safety and wonder. He is not interested in money, though he has more than enough. He is not interested in fame, though he has that in abundance. What interests him is the work itself, the process of investigation, the moment when a mystery yields its secrets, the satisfaction of building something that did not exist before. This is what redeems invention for Bell, this return to the pure pursuit of knowledge without the contamination of commerce and competition. His work with the deaf continues throughout his life and perhaps remains closest to his heart. He serves on the boards of schools for the deaf, funds research into teaching methods, advocates for integration rather than segregation of deaf children. His views on deaf education are controversial. He believes strongly in teaching deaf children to speak in red lips, to integrate into hearing society, rather than teaching them sign language and fostering a separate deaf culture. This position, called oralism, is opposed by many in the deaf community who see sign language as a legitimate language and culture in its own right, not a second-best alternative to speech. The debate becomes bitter, personal, ideological. Bell, whose entire life has been shaped by his mother's deafness and his father's work on visible speech, cannot imagine that his position might be wrong, might be imposing hearing values on deaf people, might be denying them access to a rich cultural heritage. He believes he is helping, But some deaf activists see him as an oppressor, someone whose fame and resources give him disproportionate influence over policies that affect their lives. This controversy reveals something important about Bell and about the relationship between inventors and their creations. Bell invented the telephone, but he does not control what it means or how it is used. Similarly, his advocacy for oralism in deaf education is well-intentioned but not necessarily beneficial to the people it is meant to help. Good intentions do not guarantee good outcomes. Power, even power wielded benevolently, shapes and constrains the lives of others. The telephone connects people but also enables surveillance. Oralism helps some deaf children but silences others by devaluing sign language. Every technology, every intervention, every attempt to improve the world has consequences that ripple out beyond the creator's vision or control. Bell, in his later years, begins to understand this, begins to see that his inventions and advocacy exist in contexts he does not fully understand, serve purposes he never intended. It is a humbling realization. His friendship with Helen Keller provides some comfort and perspective. Keller, who is both deaf and blind, has become famous in her own right as a writer, activist, and symbol of human potential overcoming disability. She and Bell correspond regularly, visit each other when possible, maintain a relationship of mutual respect and affection. Keller credits Bell with encouraging her education, with believing in her potential when others did not. And Bell finds in Keller a kind of validation, proof that his life's work, his obsession with communication across barriers, has meaningful impact. When they are together, they communicate through a combination of methods. Keller reads lips by touch, Bell fingerspells into her hand, they write notes. It is laborious, slow, but deeply intimate. These conversations, more than any telephone call, embody what Bell has always sought: connection despite obstacles, understanding despite difference, presence despite separation. In 1915, the first transcontinental telephone line is completed, connecting New York and San Francisco. AT&T decides to inaugurate the line with a ceremonial call, and they ask Bell to participate. He is 68 years old, white-haired, slightly deaf himself now, his once powerful voice grown thin with age. He sits in a New York office while Watson, his old assistant, his partner in those frantic days of invention, waits in San Francisco. The line opens. Bell speaks the same words he spoke 39 years earlier, when acid burned his clothes and his voice first traveled through wire. "Mr. Watson, come here, I want to see you." Anne Watson, now also old, also transformed by time, replies with words they have planned together. "It will take me 5 days to get there now." The audience at the ceremony laughs, appreciating the callback, the reminder that the continent has been conquered, that distance has been defeated, that what once took months now takes seconds. But Bell does not laugh. He is thinking about his dead brothers, his deaf mother, all the voices that have been silenced, all the distances that remain uncrossable despite his invention. The telephone can transmit voices across continents, but it cannot bring back the dead, cannot heal grief, cannot undo loss. It is a powerful tool, but it is still only a tool, limited, insufficient, incapable of solving the deepest human problems. The 20th century, which began with such technological optimism, with such faith in progress and human ingenuity, quickly reveals itself as a century of mechanized horror. In August 1914, the nations of Europe stumble into a war that will consume a generation, a war fought with industrial efficiency and technological sophistication that makes previous conflicts look primitive by comparison. And the telephone, Bell's device for human connection, becomes an instrument of slaughter. Military commanders in rear headquarters use telephones to coordinate artillery barrages, to move divisions across battlefields, to order attacks that send thousands of men climbing out of trenches into machine gun fire. The same wires that carry a father's voice to his daughter now carry orders that will orphan her. The same electromagnetic principles that allow lovers to speak across distance now allow generals to orchestrate death with unprecedented precision. Bell is horrified. He reads newspaper accounts of the war, of the trenches, of the poison gas and the aerial bombardment and the millions dead. He understands, with a clarity that makes him physically ill, that his invention has enabled this. Without telephones, modern warfare would be impossible. Armies could not be coordinated across vast fronts. Artillery could not be directed with split-second timing. The industrial scale of killing requires industrial scale of communication. The telephone does not cause the war, does not create the hatred and nationalism and imperial ambition that drive men to kill each other, but it facilitates it, makes it more efficient, more deadly. This is the dark revelation that haunts every inventor who lives long enough to see their creations weaponized. That technology is amoral, that the same principles that can heal can also harm, that there is no way to create power without creating the potential for its misuse. During the war, telephone networks become strategic targets. Armies cut enemy communication lines, tap into telephone conversations to gather intelligence, use operators as spies. The telephone, which began as a tool for intimate conversation, becomes a vector for espionage and deception. Governments develop entire bureaucracies devoted to intercepting and analyzing telephone communications. They recruit linguists, cryptographers, technical specialists who sit in windowless rooms listening to scratchy recordings of conversations, trying to extract military secrets from ordinary speech. The technology of interception evolves as fast as the technology of transmission. Special induction coils can pick up telephone conversations without physically connecting to the wire. Skilled operators can listen in on calls without leaving any trace of their presence. Privacy, which was never really a consideration in the early days of the telephone, becomes an illusion, a polite fiction that people believe because the alternative is too disturbing. The war ends in 1918, but the surveillance infrastructure it created does not disappear. Instead, it is refined, expanded, turned inward against domestic populations. Governments that learn to monitor enemy communications during wartime continue monitoring their own citizens during peacetime. Labor organizers find their phone calls tapped. Political dissidents discover that their private conversations are being recorded. The telephone, that symbol of progress and connection, becomes also a symbol of state power, of the erosion of private space, of the way technology extends the reach of authority into every corner of human life. Bell, watching this transformation, feels a deep ambivalence about his legacy. He created a tool for human connection, but he also created a tool for human control. He wanted to abolish distance, but he also abolished privacy. These were not his intentions, but intentions do not determine outcomes. The 1920s bring prosperity and rapid technological change. The telephone network expands dramatically. Automatic switching begins to replace human operators, allowing callers to dial numbers directly without asking an operator to connect them. This is celebrated as progress, as efficiency, but it also eliminates thousands of jobs held by young women, those telephone operators who formed the human heart of the network. They are replaced by mechanical switches, by relays that click and rotate, connecting calls without human intervention. The network becomes more machine-like, less personal. The operator's voice saying "number please" disappears, replaced by the impersonal buzz of the dial tone. Something is gained, something is lost. This is the pattern of technological change. Each advance brings new capabilities but also new absences, new forms of connection accompanied by new forms of isolation. Radio emerges as the telephone's younger sibling, using similar principles of electromagnetic transmission but broadcasting to many listeners simultaneously rather than connecting two people in conversation. Radio is different from the telephone in fundamental ways. The telephone is intimate, private, one-to-one. Radio is public, communal, one-to-many. But both descend from the same insights about converting sound to electrical signals, transmitting those signals through space, and reconverting them to sound. Bell himself experiments with wireless telephony, seeing radio as a natural extension of his work. He builds devices that transmit speech on beams of light, precursors to modern fiber optics, though the technology is too primitive to be practical. He understands that the principle he discovered, the principle of turning sound into electricity and back into sound, can be generalized, extended, transformed. The telephone is not an endpoint but a beginning, a proof of concept that will spawn countless descendant technologies. In the 1930s, the world slides into economic depression and then toward another, even more catastrophic war. The telephone network, now vast and sophisticated, becomes essential infrastructure for modern societies. Businesses depend on it. Governments depend on it. The average household increasingly expects to have telephone service, no longer seeing it as a luxury but as a necessity, as basic as running water or electricity. This normalization of the telephone represents Bell's ultimate triumph. His invention has become so integrated into daily life that people forget it was ever invented, forget that there was a time when speaking to someone required their physical presence. The telephone disappears into the background of existence, taken for granted, invisible until it breaks or is absent. World War II brings even more sophisticated uses of telecommunications. Encrypted telephone systems allow military and political leaders to communicate securely across continents. The technology of scrambling and unscrambling voice communications becomes a major focus of military research. Code breakers work to penetrate these systems, to listen in on enemy conversations, to gain intelligence that might shorten the war or prevent defeat. The telephone is no longer just a tactical tool for coordinating battles. It becomes a strategic asset, a means of exercising power at the highest levels of command. Winston Churchill in London speaks to Franklin Roosevelt in Washington over a secure telephone line, planning strategy, coordinating resources, making decisions that affect millions of lives. The telephone has become the nervous system of global power. But the war also demonstrates the telephone's vulnerability. When telephone lines are cut, when switching stations are bombed, communication collapses. Armies become uncoordinated, scattered, vulnerable. The telephone's power is also its weakness. The more dependent societies become on it, the more catastrophic its failure becomes. This drives research into redundant systems, into wireless alternatives, into technologies that can survive disruption. The military-industrial complex that emerges from World War II continues this research into the Cold War, developing communication systems that can survive nuclear attack, that can maintain command and control even as cities burn. The telephone evolves from a consumer product into a strategic weapon, a component of deterrence and warfighting capability. Bell, who dies in 1922, does not live to see these developments, and perhaps that is a mercy. He would have been horrified to see how thoroughly his dream of human connection has been militarized. After the war, in the 1950s and 60s, the telephone undergoes another transformation. It becomes ubiquitous. Nearly every household in developed countries has a telephone. Multiple telephones in a single house become common. Teenagers spend hours on the phone, developing their own telephone culture, their own patterns of usage that horrify their parents who grew up in a world of scarce, expensive phone calls. The telephone becomes a tool of adolescent socialization, replacing or supplementing face-to-face interaction. This creates new anxieties. Parents worry that their children are spending too much time on the phone, that virtual conversation is replacing real connection, that the telephone is somehow damaging authentic human relationships. These concerns will be repeated with each subsequent communication technology, with the internet, with social media, with smartphones, always the same fear that new forms of connection are destroying old forms, that technology is making us less human rather than more connected. The telephone also begins to change physically. The black rotary phones that dominated the mid-century start to give way to touch-tone phones, then to cordless phones, then to answering machines that capture voices in the absence of their intended recipients. Each innovation changes how people use and think about the telephone. The answering machine, in particular, creates new social dynamics. You can now call someone without the risk of actually talking to them, leaving a message instead. This seems like a small change, but it alters the social contract of telephone communication. The assumption that calling someone means talking to them in real time dissolves. Asynchronous communication becomes possible, mixing the immediacy of voice with the distance of written correspondence. People start screening calls, using the answering machine to filter who they talk to and when. The telephone becomes less intrusive, more controllable, but also less immediate, less intimate. In the 1970s and 80s, the telephone network becomes digital. The analog signals that carried voices as continuously varying electrical currents are replaced by digital signals, discrete packets of data representing sound as sequences of ones and zeros. This digitization makes the network more efficient, more reliable, capable of carrying far more information. But it also fundamentally changes what the telephone is. An analog telephone is a direct, continuous connection between 2 points, a wire carrying vibrations from one membrane to another. A digital telephone is a computer system that samples sound thousands of times per second, converts those samples to numbers, transmits the numbers, and reconstructs approximate sound at the receiving end. The difference is philosophical as much as technical. The analog telephone is a medium that directly transmits voice. The digital telephone is a system that analyzes, abstracts, transmits, and reconstructs voice. The experience is similar enough that most users do not notice the difference, but the underlying principle is completely different. Voice becomes data, just another form of information to be processed, stored, analyzed, monetized. The monopoly that AT&T held for most of the 20th century finally breaks apart in 1984, dissolved by antitrust action that splits the company into regional operating companies and a long-distance carrier. This breakup is celebrated as a victory for competition and consumer choice, and it does lead to falling prices and increased innovation. But it also fragments the integrated network that Bell and his successors built, replacing centralized control with market competition. The telephone system becomes less of a unified utility and more of a contested marketplace. New companies emerge, offering competing services, different technologies, incompatible standards. The telephone, which once represented a kind of technological unity, a single network connecting everyone, becomes multiple networks, multiple systems, multiple corporate entities competing for customers and profit. This is the paradox of market capitalism applied to communication. Competition drives innovation but also creates fragmentation, barriers, inequalities. And then, in the 1990s, the internet arrives and changes everything. The internet is not, initially, a telephone network. It is a data network designed to connect computers, to allow them to exchange information. But the internet is built on telephone infrastructure, using the same copper wires, the same switching systems, the same principles of routing signals through complex networks. And very quickly, people realize that the internet can carry voice as well as data. Voice over Internet Protocol, VoIP, emerges as a new way to make phone calls, routing voice through the internet rather than through traditional telephone switches. This is revolutionary because it means that voice communication is no longer a separate service requiring a separate network. It becomes just another application running on a general-purpose data network. The telephone, as a distinct technology, begins to disappear, absorbed into the larger category of digital communication. The internet also fulfills and transforms Bell's original dream in ways he could not have imagined. The internet is not just person-to-person communication like the telephone. It is many-to-many communication, broadcasting and conversation simultaneously, a medium where anyone can potentially reach anyone else, where information flows in all directions at once. The internet makes the telephone's one-to-one model seem limited, constrained. Why call one person when you can send a message to hundreds? Why have a conversation when you can participate in a forum, a chat room, a social network? The internet democratizes communication in ways the telephone never did, giving voice to people who were previously voiceless, creating communities that span the globe, enabling new forms of organizing, learning, creating. But the internet also amplifies all the problems that the telephone created. If the telephone enabled surveillance, the internet makes surveillance total, comprehensive, inescapable. Every action online can be tracked, recorded, analyzed. If the telephone eroded privacy, the internet eliminates it almost entirely. Your location, your purchases, your relationships, your interests, your secrets are all potentially accessible to corporations and governments with the technical means to collect and process data. If the telephone created new forms of inequality based on who had access and who did not, the internet creates even starker divides between the connected and the disconnected, between those with digital literacy and those without, between those who can afford high-speed connections and those who cannot. Every promise of connection comes with a shadow of control. Every expansion of communication comes with new mechanisms of power. The smartphone, which emerges in the early 21st century, is the culmination and transformation of everything Bell began. It is a telephone, but it is also a camera, a computer, a television, a library, a map, a social network, a portal to nearly all human knowledge and much human interaction. The smartphone makes Bell's original telephone seem quaint, limited, almost primitive. A 1970s rotary phone and a 21st century smartphone are both called phones, but they are different things entirely, separated by technological generations, by fundamentally different understandings of what communication means. The smartphone is always on, always connected, always available. It collapses all forms of media and communication into a single device carried in the pocket, consulted hundreds of times per day, integrated into every moment of waking life. It is the most successful consumer product in human history, adopted faster and more completely than any previous technology. But the smartphone also represents the fulfillment of the telephone's dark potential. It is a surveillance device, tracking your location, recording your conversations, monitoring your behavior, creating data profiles that are sold to advertisers and accessible to governments. It is addictive, designed to capture and hold attention, to create compulsive checking behaviors, to make people anxious when separated from their devices. It fragments attention, making sustained thought difficult, replacing deep engagement with shallow skimming. It creates the illusion of connection while often producing isolation, as people sit together in physical space while engaging with distant others through screens. The smartphone is both a miracle and a curse, a tool that grants incredible power while extracting terrible costs, a technology that reveals the ultimate ambiguity of Bell's legacy. Bell himself, had he lived to see smartphones, would have been both amazed and horrified. Amazed at the technical achievement, at the realization of his dream of universal communication multiplied 1,000-fold. Horrified at what has been lost, at the quality of connection sacrificed for quantity of connections, at the way voice has been reduced to just another data stream, at the surveillance and manipulation that ubiquitous communication enables. He would recognize that the smartphone descends directly from his telephone, that it represents the logical extension of the principles he discovered. But he would also see that something essential has changed, that the intimate connection between two people speaking, hearing each other's voices, sharing a moment of presence across distance, has been diluted in a flood of texts and images and videos and notifications, all competing for attention, all diminishing each other. The telephone's influence extends beyond direct descendants like the smartphone. It inspired and enabled countless other technologies. Radio broadcasting emerged from the same electromagnetic principles, using wireless transmission where the telephone used wires. Television combined radio transmission with moving images, creating a medium for visual storytelling that shaped 20th century culture. Satellite communication used the telephone's principle of long-distance transmission but routed signals through space rather than through cables. The Internet, as mentioned, was built on telephone infrastructure and inherits its logic of routing signals through networks of switches. Even technologies that seem unrelated often trace their lineage back to the telephone's fundamental insight, that information can be converted to electrical signals, transmitted through various media, and reconverted at the destination. This principle underlies most of modern civilization's communication infrastructure. The telephone also inspired new ways of thinking about communication, connection, and human relationships. Before the telephone, distance meant separation. After the telephone, distance became negotiable, something that could be overcome technologically if not physically. This changed how people thought about space, time, and presence. It became possible to maintain relationships across vast distances, to conduct business without travel, to coordinate activities without physical co-location. The telephone trained humanity to think of communication as something that could be technologically mediated, preparing the ground for all subsequent communication technologies. It normalized the idea that you could have a meaningful conversation with someone you could not see, that voice without physical presence was still valuable, still intimate, still real. This seems obvious now, but it was revolutionary in Bell's time, a fundamental shift in human experience. The legacy of the telephone is thus complex, multifaceted, impossible to reduce to simple judgments of good or bad. It connected people, enabling conversations that would otherwise have been impossible, preserving relationships that distance would have severed. It accelerated business, enabling economic growth and coordination that would have been impossible in a world limited to written correspondence. It saved lives, allowing people to summon help quickly in emergencies, to coordinate disaster responses, to share urgent information. But it also enabled surveillance, eroded privacy, facilitated warfare, created new forms of inequality, and contributed to the acceleration of modern life in ways that are both exhilarating and exhausting. The telephone is both gift and burden, solution and problem, connection and control. It is technology's essential ambiguity made tangible. Bell himself understood this ambiguity, particularly in his later years. He had enough perspective, enough distance from the initial excitement of invention, to see that his creation had escaped his control and taken on a life of its own. He saw the telephone used in ways he never intended, put to purposes he found disturbing, transformed by commercial and political forces he could not resist. But he also saw it bring joy, saw it connect families, saw it enable communication that enriched lives. His feelings about the telephone were complicated, mixed, shot through with pride and regret in equal measure. He never regretted inventing it, never wished he could take it back. But he also never stopped thinking about what it meant, what it had done, what it revealed about humanity's relationship with technology and with each other. In his final years at Bainbridge, Bell becomes increasingly philosophical, increasingly concerned with questions of meaning rather than mechanism. He is in his 70s, his health declining, his energy diminished. He can no longer work the 18-hour days that characterized his youth. His hearing, ironically, deteriorates, bringing him closer to his mother's experience, giving him new empathy for the deaf children he spent his life trying to help. He sits on the cliffs overlooking the Atlantic, watching the sun set over water, and he thinks about sound, about distance, about all the voices he has heard and all the voices he will never hear again. His brothers are long dead, their voices silenced before the telephone could have connected them. His mother is dead, her deafness undefeated despite all his technological triumphs. His father is dead, taking with him the knowledge of visible speech that shaped Bell's entire understanding of human communication. The 21st century arrives, and with it, a communications landscape that would seem like science fiction to the men and women who first spoke through Bell's device. The telephone, that mechanical assemblage of membranes and electromagnets that required shouting to be understood, has been replaced by smartphones that fit in a pocket and connect not just to other phones but to a vast digital network encompassing most of human knowledge and a significant portion of human social interaction. The transformation is so complete that calling these devices phones is almost misleading. They happen to include phone functionality, but that is just one feature among thousands, often not even the most used feature. People text more than they call. They video chat. They send voice messages. They participate in group conversations spanning multiple time zones and mediums. The one-to-one voice connection that Bell invented has been absorbed into something larger, more complex, more omnipresent. The smartphone represents both the fulfillment and the dissolution of Bell's dream. Fulfillment because humanity is now more connected than ever before in history. Anyone with a smartphone and a data connection can potentially communicate with anyone else on the planet, instantly, in multiple formats. Distance has been abolished so completely that we barely think about it anymore. A grandmother in Toronto can watch her granddaughter take her first steps in Tokyo, in real time, seeing and hearing across an ocean as if the intervening miles did not exist. A business executive can coordinate with team members on 5 continents simultaneously, orchestrating projects that would have required months of travel and written correspondence in Bell's era. A student in rural Africa with a smartphone can access educational resources that would have been unavailable to the wealthiest person of Bell's generation. The democratization of communication that the telephone began has been completed, multiplied, made nearly universal. But dissolution too, because the nature of communication has changed in ways that complicate simple narratives of progress. The telephone created intimacy through voice. The smartphone creates connection through data. These are not the same thing. When Bell spoke to Watson, when a mother in 1920 called her soldier son during a brief furlough from war, the voice was the message. The timbre, the emotion, the pauses and catch in the throat conveyed meaning that words alone could not. But contemporary communication increasingly strips away these analog signals, replacing them with digital efficiency. Text messages convey information but not tone. Emojis attempt to add emotional context but are crude approximations of human expression. Even video calls, which should be more intimate than audio calls, often feel performative, artificial, both people aware that they are on camera, playing versions of themselves rather than simply being present with each other. The quantity of communication has exploded while the quality, arguably, has declined. People send hundreds of messages per day but have fewer deep conversations. They maintain hundreds of social media connections but feel lonelier. They are always reachable but often feel unheard. This is the paradox of ubiquitous communication. The more connected we become technologically, the more disconnected we sometimes feel emotionally. Bell wanted to abolish the silence between people, to create presence despite absence. But contemporary communication often creates a new kind of silence, a noise-filled silence where everyone is talking but no one is really listening, where messages pile up faster than they can be processed, where communication becomes a burden rather than a gift. The smartphone has also fulfilled the telephone's dark potential for surveillance in ways that would have horrified Bell. Every phone is a tracking device, recording your location at all times, often down to a few meters of accuracy. Every call, text, and online interaction generates data that is collected, stored, analyzed. Corporations build detailed profiles of your behavior, your preferences, your relationships, your thoughts, selling this information to advertisers or using it to manipulate your behavior. Governments have access to this data as well, through legal warrants or illegal hacking, through cooperation with tech companies or through mass surveillance programs that collect communications in bulk. The NSA, the Chinese state security apparatus, intelligence agencies around the world have capabilities that would have seemed like dystopian fantasy 50 years ago. They can listen to any call, read any message, track any person, often without individual warrants or oversight, justified by national security concerns that are real but also conveniently expansive. This surveillance is not incidental to modern communication technology. It is built into the architecture, a necessary consequence of systems that route all communication through centralized servers owned by corporations or accessible to governments. The Internet, and the smartphone ecosystem built on top of it, is fundamentally a centralized system despite its distributed appearance. Your messages may travel through multiple nodes, but they pass through choke points controlled by a handful of companies: Google, Apple, Meta, Amazon, telecom providers. These companies can see everything you do, and what they can see, governments can access. Privacy, in any meaningful sense, is a fiction. The only question is who is watching and what they do with what they see. The social consequences of this hyper-connected, hyper-surveilled world are still unfolding, still unclear, but already troubling. Democracy is strained by misinformation that spreads faster than truth, by echo chambers that reinforce rather than challenge beliefs, by manipulation techniques that target individuals with personalized propaganda. Social cohesion fragments as people retreat into ideological bubbles, communicating primarily with those who already agree with them, losing the ability to engage productively with those who think differently. Mental health deteriorates, particularly among young people, as social comparison becomes constant and public, as bullying moves online where it is inescapable, as sleep and attention are sacrificed to the endless scroll of content designed to be addictive. The smartphone, like the television before it, is a medium that shapes consciousness, that changes how people think and feel and relate to each other, and many of those changes are negative. Yet it would be wrong to focus only on the problems. The smartphone has also enabled genuine goods. It has connected people who would otherwise have been isolated. It has given voice to the voiceless, allowing marginalized communities to organize, to tell their own stories, to challenge dominant narratives. The Arab Spring, whatever its ultimate outcomes, was coordinated largely through smartphones and social media. Black Lives Matter used digital communication to document police violence and build a movement for racial justice. Climate activists use smartphones to coordinate protests and spread information. The same tools that enable surveillance and manipulation also enable resistance and organization. Technology is always double-edged. The smartphone has also made communication accessible in ways the telephone never was. The telephone required wires, infrastructure, installation, monthly bills. The smartphone requires only a device and a data connection, and in many parts of the world, smartphone ownership has leapfrogged landline telephony entirely. People who never had a traditional phone now have smartphones. Rural villages in India, Africa, Southeast Asia are connected to the global communication network without ever going through the intermediate stages of landline phones and desktop computers. This is genuinely transformative, enabling economic participation, educational access, health information, social connection that would otherwise be impossible. The Global South is no longer waiting for the Global North's infrastructure. It is building its own, often in more innovative and efficient ways. Bell, had he lived to see this world, would have had complex reactions. He would have been amazed at the technical achievements, at the realization that voices can now travel not just through wires but through the air, through satellites, through fiber optic cables carrying light, through cellular networks that connect billions of devices. He would have been gratified to see that his fundamental principle, converting sound to electrical signals and back again, has been generalized and extended far beyond what he imagined. He would have been pleased that communication has become accessible to so many people, that the barriers of distance and infrastructure have been so dramatically reduced. His dream of a world where everyone can hear everyone else has, in some sense, been realized. But he would also have been deeply troubled. Bell believed in communication as a tool for human understanding, for connection, for empathy. He would be disturbed to see communication used primarily for commerce, for advertising, for manipulation. He spent his life trying to help deaf people connect with the hearing world, trying to bridge gaps, trying to ensure that everyone could participate in the human conversation. He would be horrified to see communication technology exacerbating inequality, creating new forms of exclusion, enabling bullying and harassment on unprecedented scales. He believed in the humanizing potential of voice, in the ability of hearing someone speak to create empathy and understanding. He would be saddened to see voice replaced by text, to see communication becoming more efficient but less human, faster but less meaningful. Most of all, Bell would understand that technology alone cannot solve human problems, that the telephone and all its descendants are tools whose value depends on how they are used, that connecting people does not automatically make them kinder or wiser or more compassionate. The telephone abolished distance but not hatred. The smartphone enables instant global communication but not instant global understanding. The same device that allows a father to tell his daughter he loves her across an ocean also allows a terrorist to coordinate an attack, a bully to torment a victim, a troll to spread hatred. Technology amplifies human nature, both its beauty and its ugliness. It does not transform it. Bell spent his final years from 1920 to 1922 in declining health but still intellectually active. He continued to work on various projects, continued to engage with the world of ideas, continued to maintain correspondence with friends and colleagues. Mabel remained his constant companion, his caretaker, his anchor. They had been married for 45 years, had raised 4 children together, had weathered the storms of fame and fortune and legal battles. Their relationship, built on communication across the barrier of her deafness, remained tender, intimate, grounded in genuine understanding. Bell communicated with Mabel through the methods they had developed over decades. Careful articulation so she could read his lips, written notes, gestures, and most of all, through a deep familiarity that allowed them to understand each other with minimal communication, the way long-married couples often do. In the summer of 1922, Bell's health deteriorates significantly. He develops complications from diabetes, a condition that was poorly understood and essentially untreatable in that era. He knows he is dying. He faces this with equanimity, without apparent fear, with a kind of philosophical acceptance. He has lived 75 years, accomplished much, loved and been loved. He has seen his invention change the world. He has pursued his curiosities wherever they led. He has helped thousands of deaf children learn to speak. He has raised a family, maintained friendships, built a life of meaning and purpose. He has few regrets. If he could do it again, he might focus less on business and legal battles, might spend more time with his children, might be more patient with those who disagreed with him. But overall, he feels his life has been well lived, his time well spent. On August 1, 1922, at his beloved Bain Brig, surrounded by family, Alexander Graham Bell dies. His last words are signed to Mabel, who sits beside his bed. He cannot speak. His voice, the voice that first traveled through wire, the voice that recited Shakespeare to an emperor, the voice that shouted for Watson across a distance measured in feet that became miles that became continents, is too weak. But his hands can still move and he signs to her, "No." It is unclear what he is refusing, what he is denying, what final statement he is making. Perhaps he is refusing death's finality, asserting his will even at the end. Perhaps he is refusing to accept that his time is over, that there is still so much to learn, so much to discover, so many more problems to solve. Perhaps he is simply communicating with his wife one last time, saying the only word he can manage, maintaining connection until the very end. The world mourns. Newspapers around the globe publish obituaries and tributes. Flags fly at half-mast. Dignitaries issue statements praising Bell's contributions to humanity. And in a gesture both symbolic and practical, at the moment of his funeral, telephone service across North America is suspended for 1 minute of silence. Millions of phones go silent simultaneously, the network that Bell created pausing to honor its creator. It is a remarkable moment, the entire continent connected by wires holding its breath together, the absence of communication serving as a memorial to the man who made communication possible. For 60 seconds, the telephone network that carries millions of conversations, that connects cities and families and businesses, goes dark. And in that darkness, in that deliberate return to silence, there is both grief and gratitude, both loss and celebration. And then the minute ends, and the network comes back to life, and the conversations resume because the telephone is not about Bell anymore, has not been about Bell for decades. It is about everyone who uses it, about all the voices it carries, about all the connections it enables. Bell's death does not slow the network's growth. Within years, telephone service expands further. Within decades, it transforms. Within a century, it evolves into something Bell would barely recognize but whose lineage he would immediately understand. The telephone is no longer an invention. It is infrastructure, assumed, invisible, essential. It is the nervous system of civilization, connecting every part to every other part, enabling the complex coordination that modern life requires. Bell is buried at Bain Brig, on a mountainside overlooking the lake he loved, the water and sky and forest that gave him peace. His grave is marked with a simple stone, understated, unlike the grandiose monuments erected for other men of his wealth and fame. He wanted simplicity. You got it? Visitors to the grave, even today, more than a century after his death, sometimes bring flowers, sometimes stand in silence, sometimes take photographs. Some are tourists who know Bell as the name on the old telephone company. Some are inventors and engineers who see him as a spiritual ancestor, proof that one person's curiosity and persistence can change the world. Some are deaf individuals who have complicated feelings about his legacy, grateful for his advocacy but critical of his oralist philosophy. All of them are connected to him, linked by the technology he helped create, by the world he helped shape. The telephone continues to evolve long after Bell's death, driven by technical innovations he could not have imagined. Transistors replace vacuum tubes, making phones smaller, cheaper, more reliable. Satellites replace undersea cables for intercontinental communication, routing signals through space rather than through water. Fiber optic cables replace copper wires, using light instead of electricity to carry information. Digital switching replaces analog, converting sound to data. Mobile networks free phones from wires entirely, allowing communication from anywhere. The internet absorbs the telephone network, making voice just another application running on a general-purpose data infrastructure. Each innovation is revolutionary, each changes how people use and think about communication, and each traces its lineage back to that day in March 1876 when Bell called for Watson and his voice traveled through wire. The principle Bell discovered, that sound can be converted to electrical signals, transmitted through various media, and reconverted to sound, is now so fundamental to modern technology that we barely think about it. Every radio, every television, every computer, every smartphone, every communication satellite, every piece of audio equipment, uses variations of this principle. The microphones that capture sound in recording studios are descendants of Bell's transmitter. The speakers that reproduce sound in concert halls are descendants of his receiver. The entire edifice of modern media, from podcasts to streaming music to video conferencing, rests on the foundation that Bell helped build. He did not invent all of this, of course. He stood on the shoulders of previous scientists and engineers, and countless others built on his work. But his contribution was crucial, a bridge between the world of mechanical sound and the world of electronic communication. What does it mean that a man haunted by silence, by the deafness of his mother and the deaths of his brothers, created a technology that filled the world with voices? What does it mean that an invention born from love and loss and the desire for connection became a tool of commerce, warfare, surveillance, and control? What does it mean that Bell's dream of presence despite absence has been realized in forms he never imagined, in a world where people are constantly connected but often feel profoundly alone? These questions have no simple answers. They force us to confront the essential ambiguity of technological progress, the way that every advance brings costs as well as benefits, that solving one set of problems creates new problems, that human ingenuity can create tools but cannot control how those tools are used or what they ultimately mean. The telephone teaches us that technology is never neutral, never merely instrumental. It shapes us as much as we shape it. It changes how we think, how we relate, how we understand space and time and presence. Before the telephone, people thought about communication differently, accepted distance differently, organized their lives differently. After the telephone, the human experience was fundamentally altered. We became people who could speak across distance, and in becoming those people, we changed what distance means, what conversation means, what it means to be present with another person. The telephone did not just transmit voices. It transmitted a new way of being human. And now, in the 21st century, we are living through another such transformation, as the smartphone and the internet reshape human consciousness in ways we are only beginning to understand. We are becoming people who are always connected, always available, always producing and consuming communication. What does this constant connectivity do to our ability to be alone, to reflect, to think deeply? What does it do to our relationships, our attention, our sense of self? We do not yet know. We are too close to the transformation, too embedded in it, to see clearly what it means. Future generations will look back on this moment and understand it better than we can, just as we can look back on Bell's era and see things that his contemporaries could not see. But even from within the transformation, some things are clear. We are more connected than ever before, and yet connection does not automatically create community. We can speak to anyone, and yet genuine conversation is rare. We have access to all information, and yet wisdom is elusive. We can broadcast our thoughts to the world, and yet we often feel unheard. The technology that was supposed to bring us together sometimes drives us apart. The tools that were supposed to amplify human connection sometimes diminish it, replacing quality with quantity, depth with breadth, meaning with noise. This is not the technology's fault. Technology does not have agency, does not make choices, does not bear moral responsibility. We make the choices. We decide how to use the tools we create. We shape the culture that determines what these technologies mean and how they function in our lives. Bell understood this, particularly toward the end of his life. He understood that the telephone was just a tool, that its value depended on what people used it for, that he could not control its meaning or its impact. He created something powerful and then released it into the world, watching it take on forms and purposes he never intended. This is the inventor's dilemma, the artist's dilemma, the dilemma of anyone who creates something that enters culture and takes on a life of its own. You cannot control the interpretation. You cannot determine the legacy. You can only create, release, and watch what happens, hope that more good than harm emerges, accept that the balance is always uncertain. The invisible thread that Bell created in 1876, that fragile wire carrying a human voice, has become a global network of fiber optic cables and satellite links and cellular towers and undersea cables and data centers, a technological nervous system that encompasses the planet. This network carries voices, yes, but also video, text, images, data, transactions, surveillance, entertainment, education, propaganda, connection, isolation, love, hate, truth, lies, everything that humans communicate to each other, all of it flowing through systems that descend, directly or indirectly, from Bell's insight about converting sound to electrical signals. The thread is no longer invisible. It is everywhere, ubiquitous, essential. We could not function without it. Our civilization would collapse if it failed. We are bound by this thread, connected by it, dependent on it, empowered by it, controlled by it. And still, despite everything, despite all the complications and contradictions, despite the surveillance and the manipulation and the way that communication technology has been weaponized and commercialized and turned into something Bell never intended, there remains something profound about the ability to hear a loved one's voice across distance. When a mother speaks to her deployed son through a video call, when friends separated by oceans have a conversation that feels almost like they are in the same room, when a dying grandparent whispers goodbye to grandchildren who cannot be there physically but can be there through technology, something meaningful happens. Distance is defeated. Connection is created. Presence manifests despite absence. This was Bell's dream, and in these moments the dream is realized, pure and uncontaminated by all the other things the technology has become. The story of the telephone is ultimately a story about human longing, about the desire to reach across distance, to touch someone we cannot physically reach, to make ourselves heard by those we love. It is a story about refusing to accept silence, refusing to accept separation, refusing to accept the limits that geography and physics place on human connection. Bell, the boy who grew up between his deaf mother and his eloquent father, the young man who lost his brothers to disease, the inventor who shouted for Watson through a device that should not have worked but did, understood this longing in his bones. He felt it personally, painfully, urgently. And from that personal pain, he created something that billions of people now use, often without thinking about it, often without knowing his name, but nonetheless connected to him across more than a century, speaking through technologies that descend from his work, continuing the human conversation that he helped amplify. On quiet nights at Bainbridge in those final years before his death, Bell would sometimes stand on the cliffs and listen. Listen to the wind, to the waves, to the birds, to the sounds of the natural world that existed before technology, before invention, before human beings decided that distance could be conquered and silence could be filled. And in those moments he would think about his mother, about whether she could feel these sounds even if she could not hear them, about whether the vibrations of the world reached her in some way he could never fully understand. He would think about his brothers, about the conversations they never had, about all the words left unspoken because death came too soon. He would think about the telephone, about all the voices it carried, about whether it had truly brought people closer or just created an illusion of closeness, about whether he had solved the problem he set out to solve or just replaced one kind of silence with another. And then he would go inside, back to Mabel, back to the warmth of human presence that no technology can replace, back to the simple fact that being with someone you love, in the same room, breathing the same air, is something that voice through wire can approximate but never quite equal. The telephone bridges distance, but it does not eliminate it. It creates connection, but connection is not the same as presence. It transmits voice, but voice is not the same as self. These are the limits that no technology can overcome, the gaps that remain despite all our ingenuity, all our invention, all our desperate reaching across the void. And yet we keep reaching. We keep inventing. We keep trying to close the distance, to make ourselves heard, to find new ways to say I am here, can you hear me, I do not want to be alone. This impulse is older than the telephone, older than language, older than humanity itself. It is the fundamental drive of all conscious beings, the need to connect, to communicate, to know that we are not isolated monads but part of something larger, connected to others, heard and understood. Bell gave us a new way to satisfy this ancient need. Whether we use that gift wisely, whether we create connection or merely noise, whether we truly hear each other or just broadcast into the void, these are questions we continue to answer, every time we pick up a phone, every time we speak across distance, every time we reach out to touch someone we cannot see and hope, desperately hope, that on the other side of all this wire and light and data, someone is listening.